Hello everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Let's get started. Night that made you want to keep the lights on, but the storm didn't care about your need for comfort. The wind screamed through the trees, lashing against the windows like 1,000 invisible hands, and the rain came down in sheets, splattering the already damp earth with furious intent. Yet, through the thick fog that had rolled in, there stood a house. Mason Turner had never planned to come to this place. In fact, if it weren't for his car breaking down on the side of the road, he wouldn't have found himself standing in front of the old mansion in the first place. It was a relic from another time, somewhere between the colonial age and an abandoned relic lost to the years. As he approached, the house seemed to swallow the dim glow from his headlights, absorbing it into the shadows that seemed to cling to the windows. The porch creaked under his weight as he stepped closer to the door, a sense of unease settling in his gut. There was something wrong about this place. The kind of wrong that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand at attention. But Mason didn't have a choice. His car was done for and it was miles to the nearest town. Besides, the landlord, old Mrs. Owens, had said that he could stay in the guest room for the night, just until he could get his car fixed in the morning. He knocked, his fist making a hollow sound on the wood. The door opened just a crack, and through the sliver of space, a pair of pale blue eyes stared at him. Mrs. Owens was small, bent with age, and her face was a patchwork of wrinkles, like a piece of old leather. She smelled faintly of lavender, but there was something beneath that scent, a sharp, unidentifiable undertone that made Mason's stomach churn. "Mr. Turner?" she croaked, her voice raspy, like she hadn't used it in years. "That's me," Mason replied, trying to sound confident despite the uneasy flutter in his chest. "You're here for the night," she said, stepping back and motioning for him to come in. The door groaned as it swung open wider, revealing the dimly lit interior of the house. The air inside was thick, stale, and smelled of old wood and dust. He stepped in, the door closing behind him with an unsettling thud. The interior of the house was just as old as the exterior, with creaky floorboards and dark corners that seemed to swallow up the light. Mrs. Owens shuffled ahead of him, her footsteps almost inaudible in the heavy silence. Mason followed her into the living room, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The living room was large, almost too large for the small cottage. Its furniture, covered in dusty sheets, seemed frozen in time. A cracked mirror hung above a fireplace that hadn't seen a flame in years. The dim light from the flickering lamp cast long, haunting shadows across the room. "Make yourself comfortable," Mrs. Owens said, her voice almost a whisper now. "You're welcome to stay in the guest room upstairs. But I warn you, it's not like the rest of the house. It's different." Mason's curiosity piqued, but he didn't press her for more information. She was strange enough without him digging into her cryptic words. "Thank you," he said, glancing nervously at the staircase leading up to the second floor. It was old, its wooden steps worn down from years of use. A faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, the smell of neglect. "You'll be all right," Mrs. Owens continued, her voice drawing his attention back to her. "I've lived here for years. But be careful. There's something about this house. It doesn't like strangers." She paused, her eyes searching his face for a reaction, and Mason felt a chill run down his spine. "Don't worry," he said, attempting to shrug off the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. "I'm just passing through." He turned to go upstairs, but before he could take a step, Mrs. Owens' voice stopped him once more. "Don't go into the attic," she whispered. Her words hung in the air, more unsettling than anything else in the house. Mason stood there for a moment, trying to understand what she meant, but Mrs. Owens had already turned away, disappearing down a hallway that led deeper into the house. He climbed the stairs to the guest room, his footsteps slow, each step creaking in protest. The hallway at the top was narrow, the walls lined with old photographs of people he didn't recognize. The air grew colder as he moved down the hall, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, just beyond his sight. The door to the guest room was ajar, and as he pushed it open, a cold gust of air hit him in the face. The room was small, with just a bed and a single lamp. The furniture was old and worn, and the walls were bare except for a few strange, faded marks that Mason couldn't quite make out. He walked over to the bed and sat down, trying to shake off the growing feeling of unease. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling like a living thing. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, and the house creaked and groaned in protest. Mason turned the lamp off and settled into bed, trying to force himself to relax. He had to sleep. He needed rest if he was going to get his car fixed in the morning. But as his eyes fluttered closed, he heard it, faint at first, a soft sound like the faintest whisper. He opened his eyes, straining to hear. It was coming from downstairs. A faint scraping sound like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. Then a low, guttural whisper that sounded too far away to be real. Mason froze. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. The house was old. It creaked. It groaned. But this was different. He slid out of bed, careful not to make a sound. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he moved cautiously to the door. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound from downstairs grew louder, more distinct, like something, or someone, was moving in the dark. It wasn't Mrs. Owens. She was too old to move like that. Something else was here. He reached for the door frame, his hand trembling as he felt the cold, slick wood beneath his fingers. The whispering continued and the scraping sound followed. The house was alive with a kind of dread. Something was waiting. And Mason wasn't sure if it was waiting for him. The air was thick in the hallway, stifling, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Mason stood frozen in the doorway of the guest room, his heart hammering in his chest. The house groaned again, a deep, unsettling noise, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. The scraping sound that had started faintly had now become unmistakable, like nails dragged across the floorboards. He couldn't just stay here, cowering in the dark, hoping it would all stop. That was the instinct of a child, not an adult who had been on the road for days and had faced much worse. Mason gritted his teeth and forced himself to move, his legs stiff as he stepped out of the room. The hallway stretched before him, dark and narrow, the floorboards creaking under his weight with every step. He tried to convince himself it was just the house settling. Old houses made strange noises, didn't they? But this felt different. This felt intentional, as if something was trying to communicate with him, something just beyond his comprehension. Mason approached the stairs, hesitating at the top. The sounds were clearer now, coming from below. The scraping was followed by something softer, a faint shuffle of footsteps. And then, just as he thought he might head down, the whispering returned, louder now, directly behind him. He spun around, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, its darkness now swallowing the light from the dim bulb overhead. Mason's breath hitched in his throat, a chill spreading down his spine. It was impossible. He could feel the weight of someone, or something, watching him. The air felt wrong, heavy with the promise of something sinister. His gaze shifted to the closed door at the far end of the hall. The attic. Mrs. Owens' warning echoed in his mind, "Don't go into the attic." But something in him tugged toward it. There was a mystery there, a secret the house was trying to keep hidden. He had to know what it was. He had to know what was making those noises. With a breath that tasted like smoke, he turned and headed toward the door. The hallway stretched in front of him, every shadow seeming to reach out, like fingers trying to grab him. His fingers brushed the doorknob, cold to the touch, and for a second he thought he heard something, a voice, faint like a whisper but far too real to ignore. "Get out." It was faint, almost drowned out by the storm outside, but it was there. And it was enough to send Mason's heart into a furious race. He turned the knob, the door creaking open with a groan that sent a ripple of dread through him. The attic stairway was there, dark and narrow, the steps leading up to an unseen void. The air grew colder the further he went. The house seemed to breathe around him, the walls pressing in on him as if trying to suffocate him in its dark secrets. He ascended the stairs slowly, cautiously, each step creaking under his weight. As he reached the top, a chill ran up his spine, and the hair on his neck stood at attention. He stood in front of the attic door, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. It didn't move at first, as though something on the other side was holding it shut. Then, with a violent snap, it gave way, the door swinging open with an unnerving speed. The attic was cold. Cold in a way that felt unnatural, as if it had been sealed off from the warmth of the rest of the house for years, maybe longer. The air was damp, musty with the smell of old, decaying wood and dust. Mason stepped inside, the floorboards creaking underfoot, and scanned the room. It was cluttered with old furniture, broken down boxes, and cobwebs draped across the beams above. The space felt forgotten, abandoned by time and the world outside. But something was wrong. There was a feeling in the air, a sense that he wasn't alone. It was as though something in the attic had been waiting for him. He moved further into the room, his steps slow, deliberate, as if afraid of disturbing something that had been dormant for far too long. His eyes scanned the piles of forgotten objects, rusted tools, ancient trunks, yellowed papers scattered across the floor. And then, in the far corner of the room, he saw it. A strange symbol had been scrawled on the wall. It was barely visible at first, hidden beneath layers of dust, but as Mason drew closer, it became clearer. The symbol was crude, as though it had been drawn by hand, its lines sharp and jagged. It looked almost like a warning, a mark that had been left behind to keep people away. His heart skipped a beat as he stared at it. There was something about it, something that made him feel dizzy. His pulse quickened, his vision blurring for a moment. Then, just as suddenly, everything snapped back into focus. He wasn't alone anymore. There, in the shadows of the attic, something moved. A figure, dark and indistinct, a silhouette that seemed to shift with the dim light. Mason froze, his breath caught in his throat. It was too dark to see clearly, but he could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, pressing in on him. His hand shot out toward the door, but before he could reach it, the figure stepped forward and the whispering began again. This time it was clearer, more distinct. It was the same voice, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a low murmur, like a chant, like words he didn't understand but felt deep in his bones. "Leave, or we'll take you." Mason's blood ran cold. His heart pounded in his chest, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop even lower. He glanced back at the door, but it wasn't there anymore. The stairs were gone. The exit had disappeared, leaving him trapped in the attic with whatever was lurking in the shadows. Panic set in, but he forced himself to breathe, to think. There had to be a way out. The figure in the corner didn't move, just stood there, watching him, waiting for him to make the first move. But Mason knew he couldn't stand there forever. Whatever this was, this thing, it wasn't going to just let him leave. "It wants you," the voice hissed. "It has always wanted you." The attic seemed to close in around him, and for a moment, he felt the weight of the past pressing down on his shoulders. The house wasn't just old, it was alive. Alive with something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting for a chance to claim its prize. And Mason was its prize. Mason's breath hitched as the darkness in the attic seemed to deepen, folding in on itself, turning every corner into an impenetrable void. The floor beneath him felt unstable, as if the very foundation of the house were shifting, groaning under the pressure of some unseen weight. His heart thudded loudly in his ears, drowning out the whispering for a moment, but when he glanced back at the corner, the figure was still there, looming, watching, waiting. He had to move. He didn't know how or why, but the primal instinct to escape was all-consuming. His legs were stiff, but he forced himself to take a step back, his eyes never leaving the dark shape that stood motionless in the corner. The cold in the room had grown unbearable, thick with an unnatural chill that seemed to crawl under his skin. The whispering returned, this time louder, almost frantic. The voice echoed in his mind, reverberating through his skull. "Leave now, Mason. Knows you. It's waiting for you to understand, *." He clenched his fists, feeling the weight of his fear pressing against his chest. Whatever this was, whatever had been haunting him in this house, it wasn't going to let him leave without a fight. But he wasn't going to let it take him without one either. Mason's gaze flickered to the door, the one that had vanished a moment ago. It was back now, standing wide open, the stairs leading down into the gloom of the hallway. But something didn't feel right. The house was too quiet now. The wind outside had stopped howling, the storm holding its breath as if waiting for something. The figure in the corner twitched. Mason's body went rigid. His pulse quickened. The figure, it wasn't just a shadow. It was moving. No, it wasn't a figure at all. It was a presence, a shape that existed without form, an emptiness that seemed to consume the light around it. And then, from within the darkness, came a sound, a low, guttural growl, like the rumble of thunder too close for comfort. "You can't leave," the voice said, louder now, as if the very air itself was speaking to him. "You belong here." His feet moved before his mind could catch up, driven by sheer terror. He turned toward the stairs, but as he did, he felt a cold hand, something ice-cold, like the touch of death itself, grip his shoulder. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the suffocating blackness in the corner. A scream rose in his throat, but he choked it back. He had to think. He had to get out of here before it, whatever it was, reached out and dragged him into the darkness with it. The figure was closer now, the space between them shrinking, its shape coalescing into something more distinct. No, this wasn't a person. This was something else, something older and far more terrifying than he had imagined. His back slammed into the wall behind him, and Mason's breath came in ragged gasps as he watched the shape in the corner stretch and sway, like it was made of smoke, but somehow more solid, more real. Its form seemed to flicker in and out of focus, and each time it did, Mason felt a wave of nausea wash over him, his body recoiling from the sheer wrongness of it. The growl grew louder, and then came a voice, *No, a hiss*. that crawled beneath his skin, curling its way into his mind. You should have never come here. Mason fought to keep his legs from giving out beneath him. He had to escape. He had to find a way out. His hand trembled as he reached for his pocket, pulling out his phone. The screen lit up, casting a dim glow across the room, but when he tried to unlock it, the screen flickered and went black. The phone was dead. In the brief moment that the light had shone from the screen, he had seen something, a movement, a shape, flashing in the corner of his vision. His heart raced and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. The room was shrinking. The walls seemed to close in, the space getting smaller and smaller, pressing him toward the center. The attic felt like a trap, the very air too thick to breathe, the weight of something ancient settling in around him, suffocating him, trapping him in its web. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command, a demand that vibrated through his chest, as if the very foundation of the house was speaking directly to him. He had no choice but to obey, didn't he? He was running out of time. He could feel it, the presence moving closer, the heat of its malevolent gaze sinking into his skin. It wasn't going to let him leave. But the door was still open. The stairs were just a few feet away. All he had to do was run. Mason didn't give himself time to think. He pushed off the wall and darted for the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the silence, growing louder with every step. The cold hand that had gripped him earlier seemed to reach for him again, but this time he was faster. He reached the top of the stairs, and as he descended, the darkness behind him seemed to follow, the growl echoing in his ears, building, swelling into something terrifyingly real. "You're mine." The voice wasn't just in his head now. It was all around him, reverberating through the walls, through the house itself. The stairs seemed to stretch on endlessly, like a tunnel that refused to end, and Mason's mind screamed, his body refusing to obey his frantic thoughts. At the bottom of the stairs, the hallway stretched before him, but the light was flickering. The house was moving, warping, shifting in unnatural ways. The hallway seemed to twist and turn, each bend leading deeper into the labyrinth of the house. The house was alive, and it was hungry. Mason's body was on autopilot now, his limbs carrying him forward even as his mind screamed at him to stop. He didn't know where he was going, but he had to move. He had to keep moving. As he reached the end of the hallway, he saw it, an open door. A way out, the front door. But the door was already closing. Something stood on the other side, blocking his path. A figure. A person. No, not a person. A shadow, a silhouette, dark and twisted, its features too indistinct to make out. The door shut with a quiet finality that echoed in the stillness. Mason was trapped. The house had him now. Mason's pulse raced as he backed away from the closed door. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, his hands trembling at his sides. The dark figure that had blocked the door was gone now, but its presence still lingered in the air, oppressive and heavy. The silence of the hallway pressed in on him, a suffocating weight that made it hard to think. His mind was a storm of panic and confusion, but one thought cut through it all. He was trapped. The house seemed to be alive, its walls shifting, creaking, groaning as though the very bones of the building were alive and breathing. The floor beneath him felt unstable, as if it might give way at any moment. His eyes flicked to the other rooms in the hallway, each door closed, each one hiding something unknown, something dangerous. But he couldn't stay here, couldn't keep running through the endless maze of corridors. He needed to find a way out. Turning sharply, Mason made his way toward the stairs again, his footsteps loud in the stillness. The air around him seemed colder now, biting at his skin as he descended. The house's unnatural chill wrapped around him, seeping into his bones, making every step feel heavier, as if the house itself were trying to weigh him down. The growl from earlier echoed faintly in the distance, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to reverberate through the walls, shaking the very foundation of the house. Mason's chest tightened at the sound, but he forced himself to keep moving. He had to find a way out. He couldn't stay here, couldn't let whatever this was claim him. His hand reached out for the banister, cold and slick beneath his touch, but just as his fingers brushed against the wood, a sudden sharp crack filled the air. Mason froze. The noise came from above, something breaking, something heavy. He slowly looked up, his stomach lurching as he realized that the ceiling was buckling. The floorboards above him had begun to split, small cracks forming like veins spreading across a wound. Something was moving up there, something large, something heavy, something that shouldn't be moving at all. Mason's breath caught in his throat as he stepped back, his eyes wide with fear. Whatever was upstairs, it wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in the way he understood. It was something older, something that had been waiting, patient, beneath the layers of time and decay. The scraping sound from earlier returned, louder now, as if whatever was above him had heard him, sensed him. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a presence moving across the floorboards, growing closer with every passing second. Mason's instinct told him to run, to get as far away as possible, but his feet felt like lead, unwilling to obey his panicked mind. He turned toward the hallway again, his gaze searching for an escape, but the house seemed to warp around him, each door leading into another dark, empty room. There was no way out. The sound of something heavy scraping against the floor above him sent a chill down his spine. Mason looked up again. This time, the cracks in the ceiling had spread further, the wood groaning as something massive moved above. He could hear it now, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, dragging across the floor. He wasn't alone. His mind screamed at him to leave, to find a way out of this nightmare, but his legs refused to move. He could feel it, whatever it was close, moving closer with every passing second. And then, with a deafening crack, a piece of the ceiling broke away and a dark shape fell through. Mason stumbled backward, his heart racing, his breath caught in his throat. The shape was huge, its limbs twisted and malformed, its body contorted in unnatural angles. It was as though the figure had once been human, but now it was something else. Something monstrous, something born of darkness. The thing lay still for a moment, its body twitching and convulsing, and then it rose. Slowly, impossibly slowly, it pushed itself up from the floor, its eyes glinting in the dim light. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was a mask of contorted flesh, twisted into a grotesque parody of human features. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and then it let out a low, guttural hiss. Mason's legs finally moved, his body reacting to the terror flooding through him. He turned and ran down the hall, his mind barely able to process the horror he had just witnessed. He heard the thing behind him, its footsteps thudding heavily against the floor as it pursued him. He needed to get outside. The front door was still the only way out, and it was his only hope. But as he reached the door, it slammed shut with a violent force, the wood shuddering in its frame. Mason threw himself against it, but the door didn't budge. He pounded on the door, his fists striking the wood, but it felt as though the house itself were holding it shut, as if it had a will of its own, a need to keep him inside. The growl was closer now, a deep, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the very air around him. Mason stepped back, his body trembling, and as he turned to look over his shoulder, the thing from the ceiling emerged from the shadows, its eyes locked on him. It didn't move like a human. It didn't walk. It glided, hovering just above the floor, its movements jerky and erratic. The thing's mouth stretched open wider, impossibly wide, and for the briefest moment, Mason saw something in its throat. A dark, endless void, a place where light did not exist. He felt the pull, the cold grip of it, as though it were reaching into his soul, trying to drag him into that abyss. A sound broke through the terror, a loud thud, and Mason turned just in time to see a section of the floorboard splintering, cracking open beneath him. The air grew colder, the ground beneath him shifting, and before he could react, the floor gave way. He fell. Down into the dark. The world went black. Mason's body slammed against something hard, the impact jarring every bone in his body, but he barely registered the pain. The fall had been long, longer than he expected, and the darkness was absolute. He could feel the weight of the earth around him, the pressure of the walls closing in as though the house was a living, breathing entity, shifting and swallowing him whole. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs were sluggish, his muscles aching from the fall. His breath came in ragged gasps as he forced his eyes open, though it didn't matter. There was nothing to see. The darkness was thick, suffocating, like a blanket wrapped tightly around him, keeping him from seeing even the faintest sliver of light. Panic surged through him. He couldn't stay here. Not like this. He scrambled to his feet, his hands brushing against the damp, uneven floor, his fingers skimming the jagged edges of something cold and metallic. He hissed as the sharp edge cut into his skin, but the pain was distant, insignificant in comparison to the terror gnawing at him. Where was he? What was this place? The air down here was heavy, thick with the scent of rot and decay, like the bowels of a forgotten grave. The silence pressed down on him like a physical weight, broken only by the soft, wet noises of something, someone, moving in the distance. A distant shuffle. A dragging sound. Mason's heart skipped a beat. No. His mind screamed at him to stay still, to hold his breath, but he couldn't help it. He had to move. He had to get away from whatever was in the shadows. He had to survive. The air was too close now, his breath growing shallow as the stench of mold and dirt filled his nostrils. His eyes were still straining in the darkness, but there was nothing. Just shadows, just the endless, oppressive blackness. And then came the sound again. The scrape of something moving. The floor beneath him creaked and Mason froze, his heart hammering in his chest. It wasn't just a shadow. Whatever was down here with him wasn't just an idea or a memory. It was real. And it was moving closer. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath, but his pulse roared in his ears, drowning out everything else. His hand shot out to the wall beside him, his fingers grazing the cold stone surface. He felt a shiver of dread creep up his spine. The wall felt like it was alive with the weight of something ancient, something forgotten. And in that moment he realized something else. The floor was shifting beneath him. He could feel it, the subtle vibrations of movement. Something was crawling beneath him. Something big. Mason's stomach twisted, nausea rising as his thoughts scrambled to make sense of it. He could hear the sounds now clearer, closer. The shuffle of feet, the dragging of something heavy, wet, and unnatural. Asterisk, get up. Move, asterisk. He pushed himself to his feet, his muscles protesting, but he didn't care. He had to get away. He stumbled forward, his hands outstretched to catch himself against the wall. His feet felt clumsy, sluggish, as if they weren't his own. The walls around him seemed to close in tighter with every step, like they were guiding him, forcing him deeper into whatever darkness this place held. He stumbled over something, a discarded pile of rubble, and barely managed to catch himself before crashing to the ground again. He was breathing too fast now, his chest tightening with each ragged breath. His vision blurred, his body screaming for rest, but he couldn't stop. Not with whatever that was coming after him. The dragging noise grew louder, more distinct. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Mason froze, his blood running cold. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound he had heard before. It was as though the house had taken a breath, holding it in, waiting. And then, from the darkness, he heard it. A voice. It was low and guttural, like the growl of an animal, but there was something more to it. Something human. Something wrong. The voice seemed to echo in his skull, reverberating in the hollow space between his ears. It wasn't just speaking. It was reaching inside him, twisting his thoughts, making his skin crawl. You cannot escape. The words rang out in his mind, clear as day, though no one had spoken them aloud. They were inside him now, burrowing deep, and Mason felt the sharp, stabbing pain of realization. This wasn't just the house. It wasn't just some haunted, decaying place. It was alive, and it knew him. The walls felt tighter now, pressing in on him, constricting like the ribcage of some great beast. He could feel the floor beneath his feet trembling, and the walls seemed to pulse with an eerie, slow rhythm, like a heart beating deep within the earth. It knows you, the voice whispered again, and this time Mason felt it deep in his bones, in his very soul. He wasn't just a visitor here. He was a part of it, a part of this place. This place, Mason finally understood it. The house wasn't just a structure. It was a prison, and he was trapped inside it. He could hear the shuffle again. Closer, closer. The thing in the dark was coming for him, and there was nowhere to hide, no escape. With one final desperate surge of adrenaline, Mason pushed himself forward, stumbling blindly through the blackness. His fingers brushed against something smooth, something soft. He reached for it, his pulse racing. A door. A handle. He pulled, but the door didn't budge. It was locked. No, please. He pounded on the door with his fists, his knuckles splitting, blood trickling down his hands, but the door didn't move. It wouldn't open. And then, as though the house had made its decision, the floor beneath him gave way again. This time there was no fall. The ground sucked him in. Mason's body slammed into the cold, wet earth, and then, nothing. The darkness swallowed him whole. Chapter 6. Echoes in the Walls. Mason's body ached, every muscle screaming in protest, but he couldn't focus on the pain. His mind was still swimming in a fog of confusion, trying desperately to make sense of what had just happened. One moment he was standing in that cold, dark hallway, desperate to escape, and the next he was here, wherever here was. He forced his eyes open, the air around him thick and damp, carrying the smell of old wood and earth. His vision was blurry at first, but slowly things came into focus. The ground beneath him felt soft, like the dirt of a grave, cold and unyielding. He could feel something slick under his palms, something wet, and when he pulled his hands back, they were stained with thick, dark fluid. The walls around him loomed tall, jagged, and unfamiliar, covered in something like moss or mold. The edges of the stone were blackened, as if time itself had left its mark. The faintest whisper of something moving in the walls made his spine tighten. He scrambled to sit up, his breath catching in his throat as he realized the true scale of his surroundings. The space was enormous, vast like some forgotten underground chamber. But it wasn't natural. There was something off about it, something artificial. As if this wasn't a place shaped by time or nature, but by someone. Someone who had wanted this place to be forgotten. And then there was the sound. Low, rhythmic, as though the house itself was breathing. A deep, hollow thrum that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath him. The walls, the floor, they weren't just silent stone. They were pulsing like they were alive. The idea struck him with the force of a blow, and he recoiled, scrambling away from the sensation. His heartbeat was in his ears, and the closer he got to the walls, the more distorted the noise became. It wasn't just one heartbeat, there were multiple. Many. The sound swirled in his head, overlapping and splitting like fractured echoes bouncing off the walls. He stood up slowly, the room spinning around him. His legs felt weak beneath him, like they might give way at any moment. But he couldn't stay here. He couldn't be trapped in this place. Not with whatever it was. The thing that had been following him. The thing that knew him. His fingers trembled as he reached out for the nearest wall, his palm skimming the slick surface. It was covered in some strange iridescent substance, a kind of slime that clung to his skin as he brushed against it. His stomach churned at the sensation, but he forced himself to move forward. Every step felt heavy, as though the very air around him was holding him back, pulling him down into the bowels of this terrible place. The further he went, the darker it became. The faint light he had noticed when he first woke up now seemed to flicker and die, leaving him in total darkness. There was no sound, no movement, just the feeling of being utterly alone. He stumbled over something soft, and fell hard onto the ground. His hands shot out to catch himself, but they met nothing but more of that cold, damp earth. Panic surged in him, and he scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. His breathing was fast and ragged, his pulse spiking in his throat. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness seemed to part. A dim light appeared in the distance, a faint glimmer far off in the black. It was faint, almost too subtle to be real, but it was there. And it was his only hope. Mason didn't hesitate. He moved toward the light, his legs carrying him faster than they had before, his feet barely touching the ground. The farther he went, the more the air shifted. It grew colder, but also heavier, as if the light wasn't just illuminating the space, it was drawing him into it. A siren's call. A promise. But as he got closer, the light began to change. It flickered, bending and warping, as though it wasn't a natural source of light at all. It took on a strange, unsettling quality, like the glow of a dying candle, struggling against the dark. Mason slowed as he approached the source, and what he saw made his stomach turn. It wasn't a lamp or a torch. It wasn't a light at all. It was a hole. A hole in the wall, its edges lined with jagged stone, the air around it shimmering with an unnatural heat. The light didn't come from any source. It seemed to radiate from the hole itself, like the darkness had taken on a form, a physical presence. And through the hole Mason saw something. At first it was too faint to make out, but then the shapes became clearer. Dark figures, shadows, moving behind the hole. They were human-shaped, but they weren't human. Their faces were twisted, their forms stretched and distorted, as though they had been contorted by some unseen force. Their eyes were black holes, voids that seemed to draw everything in, and they were reaching for him. Their hands, pale and clawed, stretched through the opening, grasping toward him with hunger. Mason's blood ran cold. He staggered back, his hands shaking violently as he instinctively tried to close the distance between himself and the hole. But the shadows reached farther, their fingers grazing the edges of the hole, inching closer to him. He couldn't breathe. The walls were moving again, the pulsing sensation growing more intense, thrumming through the floor, through his body, as though he were being swallowed whole by the very building. The shadows reached farther, their fingers scraping against the stone, the scraping sound deafening in the silence. And then, through the black void of their eyes, Mason heard it. A voice. But not just any voice. His own voice. It whispered to him. No, it screamed at him. You should have never come here, Mason. The voice echoed in his mind, and his chest tightened. This wasn't just some twisted version of the house. It was tied to him, to his past, to his family. The floor beneath him shook, and the shadows in the hole swirled, writhing like snakes, eager to pull him inside. No, he couldn't, he wouldn't let them take him. Mason turned to run, but the walls closed in, the space growing smaller and smaller, until he was pressed up against them. A sharp, inhuman scream filled the air, and then the world around him went dark. Mason's head throbbed, a dull ache spreading behind his eyes. His limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as though the darkness itself had seeped into his very bones. When he tried to move, the ground beneath him shifted, and his stomach churned violently. He was still lying on the cold, damp floor, the smell of decay thick in the air, but this time it wasn't just the smell of rot. There was something new here, something metallic and sharp, lingering in the air as if the very space he occupied had become infected. He blinked rapidly, trying to force the disorienting fog from his mind. The darkness pressed down on him, so thick he could barely see his own hands in front of his face, but he forced himself to rise, gritting his teeth against the overwhelming sense of unease that threatened to paralyze him. His hands landed on the cold floor, pushing himself upright with a grunt. The air was different now. It had shifted as if something else had entered the room, something with a presence, something waiting. The silence around him felt like it had weight, the oppressive quiet wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. He could feel the house watching, listening, waiting. Mason swallowed hard. He wasn't sure how much longer he could stand this place, this feeling of being trapped, suffocated by the walls themselves. And worse, the things that were in the dark with him. The shadows, the whispers, the voices that weren't his own. He pushed forward, forcing his feet to move, each step slow and calculated. He didn't know what else to do. He didn't know where he was. All he knew was that he had to move, had to get away from whatever had been stalking him. His heart raced, thudding heavily in his chest as he shuffled forward, each movement feeling more like a desperate escape than a step toward any kind of safety. The walls around him seemed to close in again, the space narrowing as if the house itself were breathing, inhaling with each passing second. He pressed his palm against the cold stone, trying to steady himself, trying to ground himself in this terrible reality. But it wasn't working. He could feel the pressure, the walls bending inward like a crushing weight. His lungs burned with each breath. Then he heard it, a faint scraping sound. It came from the direction he was moving toward. Slow, methodical. A sound like claws dragging across the stone as though something, or someone, was coming for him. Mason froze, his blood turning to ice. His hand gripped the wall harder, his nails digging into the rough surface. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he was frozen, paralyzed with terror. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. The sound grew louder, closer. Then, without warning, the scraping stopped. Everything went silent. Mason didn't dare move. His chest was tight, his body tense, every muscle coiled in anticipation. The silence pressed in on him like a vice, and in that stillness, the weight of the air around him felt heavier than ever before. But then, *thump star. A dull, heavy thud. Something was in the room with him. He jerked his head to the side, but the darkness was too thick. His eyes strained, trying to make out any shape, any movement. But it was hopeless. The shadows swallowed everything. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel it. The presence. Something, or someone, was out there watching him. Waiting. He knew he was there. Mason slowly backed away, each step more hesitant than the last, but the walls were closing in faster now. Every step he took felt like a trap. Each inch he moved sending a ripple through the air, making it harder to breathe. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the adrenaline surging through his veins as the fear clawed at him, threatening to overwhelm him. And then, through the oppressive blackness, something caught his eye. A small flicker of light. It was distant, far off in the darkness, but it was there. It wasn't like the hole he'd seen earlier. It was faint, a soft glow that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. His eyes narrowed, instinct kicking in. It was his only chance. He had to move toward it, had to get to it. He didn't think. He ran. His feet barely touched the ground as he sprinted, his legs burning with each step, his breath ragged in his chest. The shadows seemed to follow, stretching out toward him like fingers desperate to pull him back. He could feel the darkness tugging at him, trying to drag him down into the depths, but he didn't stop. The light grew brighter as he got closer, the soft glow becoming more intense, more tangible. And then, without warning, the darkness lifted. He skidded to a halt. Mason stood in a small, narrow room, if you could even call it that. The light came from a single flickering bulb that hung from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow hue across the space. The walls were made of old, crumbling stone, the mortar cracked and broken in places. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of decay, but at least it was stable, solid, real. But it was the room itself that stopped him in his tracks. In the center of the room, against the far wall, there was a door. Wooden, covered in grime and age. It looked as though it had been untouched for years. Mason's breath caught in his throat as he approached it, drawn to it despite the danger. There was something familiar about it, something he couldn't quite place. Something in his gut told him it was important. This door, this room. He reached out, his hand trembling as his fingers brushed against the cold wood. The moment he touched it, the air shifted again. The temperature dropped, and the faint, distant whispers returned, rising from somewhere deep in the walls. He stepped back, heart hammering in his chest. His breath was coming faster now, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, all jumbled together, none of them making any sense. "Do not open it." The whisper came, low and venomous, like a breath against his ear. The voice was distorted, harsh. But Mason didn't stop. He pushed the door open. The door creaked loudly as Mason pushed it open, the sound so sharp and jagged it seemed to split the silence in two. For a moment, he stood frozen, staring into the dark void beyond the threshold. A cold draft poured out, carrying with it a scent that was both familiar and deeply unsettling, something sour and metallic, tinged with the smell of old books and rotting wood. His hand trembled as he stepped forward, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling as he crossed into the room. He had no idea what he expected, but it certainly wasn't this. The room was small, smaller than the one he had just left, and the only light came from the flickering bulb above. It cast long, dancing shadows across the walls, but it wasn't the shadows that held his attention. No, it was the object in the center of the room. A chair. It sat alone in the middle of the space, facing away from him. It was an old wooden chair, worn with age, the seat threadbare, its legs scratched and scuffed. But what drew Mason's gaze, what made his skin crawl, were the straps. Thick leather straps attached to the armrests and the legs. The kind of straps meant to hold something, or someone, in place. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't right. This couldn't be right. The whispers returned then, louder now, almost like voices pleading with him, begging him to leave. They came from all sides, from the walls, the floor, from the very air around him. His mind scrambled for a way to make sense of it all, but nothing fit. The house, the shadows, the strange noises, it was all a nightmare, a terrible, twisted dream he couldn't wake up from. But this chair, this thing in the center of the room, it was different. It felt like it had a purpose, a history, something tied to this place. It wasn't just an object, it was part of the story. The floor creaked behind him and Mason's blood froze. The sound was too deliberate, too slow. Someone, something, was in the room with him. He whirled around, his breath catching in his throat. Nothing. No one. Just the shadows stretching toward him as if they were alive, moving in the flickering light. The room was cold, the air thick with the sense of something watching, something waiting. He took a step forward, his foot landing heavily on the wooden floor. The creak echoed, louder now, more pronounced, and he found himself drawn back toward the chair. The closer he got, the more the weight of the room pressed in on him, pushing against his chest, making it harder to breathe. The straps seemed to twitch, as though they were alive, as though they were expecting something. Without thinking, Mason reached out and touched one of the straps. The moment his fingers brushed against the leather, he felt a jolt of cold run through him, like the very air around him had turned to ice. A sharp gasp escaped his lips, but before he could pull his hand away, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through his bones. The chair moved. It didn't slide, didn't scrape across the floor. No, it shifted, the whole thing, the legs bending in a way that was unnatural, as though something beneath the chair were alive, pushing it into position. Mason staggered backward, his heart racing as the shadows in the room grew deeper, longer, more pronounced. The air felt thick with malice, and the whispers were no longer distant. They were right next to him, pressing in on his mind, clawing at his thoughts. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was so close now, too close. His head spun, his stomach twisted in knots. The pressure in the room was suffocating, the whispers like thousands of voices, each one tearing at his sanity. The chair stopped moving. And then the room went deathly silent. Mason could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the darkness pressing down on him like a weight. His mouth was dry, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to get out of this house, away from whatever had brought him here. But something rooted him in place. Something curious. The chair. It felt like it was waiting for him. Like it wanted him to sit in it, to take the place of the person who had once been strapped there. It felt like it had always been waiting for him. The longer he stared at it, the more he felt something pulling him closer. He wasn't sure what he feared more, the chair itself or the fact that he could almost hear it whispering his name. His heart hammered in his chest, a thudding, steady pulse that filled his ears. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he took a step toward the chair. The moment his foot touched the floor, the entire room seemed to lurch, like a breath caught in a storm. His vision blurred, and the shadows seemed to bend around him, reaching for him, swallowing him whole. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, a shrill cacophony that rattled his bones. No, Mason. Don't sit in the chair. We'll take you to He froze. The voice was his own. It came from deep inside him, a memory he hadn't even realized he had. The voice of someone who had been here before, someone who had been trapped. The truth slammed into him with the force of a freight train. This was his fate. This was where it had all been leading. The house, the shadows, the whispering voices, it had all been waiting for him to take his place in that chair. Mason stumbled back, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. His legs felt weak, like they were about to give way. He wanted to scream, to run, but the room was closing in, the walls pressing in on him, the shadows crawling toward him. The whispers were growing louder, more urgent, like they were pulling at his very soul. The chair straps seemed to twitch, moving like fingers eager to bind him, to hold him. And then, with a sound that was far too familiar, the floor beneath him gave way. A terrible, ripping sound filled the air, and the ground beneath his feet crumbled, like the earth was tearing open to swallow him whole. He tried to scream, to reach for anything, but it was too late. He was falling into the darkness. The sensation of falling didn't feel real at first. It was as if the world itself had unraveled beneath him, pulling him into a void so deep and endless that his mind couldn't grasp it. Mason's body flailed in the darkness, his arms outstretched as he tumbled through the cold, damp air. His stomach churned, and he could feel the earth slipping away from beneath him, the crushing weight of the blackness around him pressing against his chest. But then the fall stopped. The sudden shift felt like hitting a brick wall, and Mason gasped, the air knocked from his lungs. For a split second he thought he might have blacked out. His body lay sprawled on something soft, but his mind couldn't make sense of the feeling. He couldn't process what was happening, how he had gotten here, where here even was. His heart was pounding, the rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins as he lay on his back, struggling to catch his breath. The darkness was still thick around him, suffocating, but there was something else now. Something faint. A sound. Soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in a faraway forest, but it grew louder with every passing second. The sound of breathing. He froze. It was coming from somewhere near, somewhere just out of reach, like a presence that loomed over him, waiting. Mason's heart pounded even harder in his chest, a suffocating rhythm that filled his ears. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, stale air, and something sharp, metallic, almost alive. The scent of decay was everywhere, hanging in the air like a thick fog. His hand shot out, his fingertips brushing against the cool stone beneath him. He pushed himself up with a grunt, his legs weak, but he had to stand. He couldn't stay here. Whatever was waiting in the darkness, he didn't want to find out. Mason squinted, trying to make sense of his surroundings. He could see nothing but blackness stretching out before him. His head spun as he pushed himself to his feet, the ground uneven, shifting beneath him as though it were unstable, ready to swallow him whole again. And then, the breathing star. It was closer now. The sound was unmistakable, slow and deliberate, like the draw of a breath too deep to be human. A slow inhale, as if something unseen was drawing the air from the very space around him. Mason's skin prickled, and his eyes snapped to the shadows ahead. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel it, the presence of something watching him. Something waiting. He dared not move. He stood frozen, his breath shallow and uneven, straining to hear, to feel what was out there. The shadows shifted around him, closing in, stretching further into the depths of the darkness. And then, just as he thought the air itself would collapse on him, the breathing stopped. It was gone. Silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful. It was unnatural. Mason didn't know how long he stood there, listening to the void. The seconds stretched, warping the very nature of time, until it felt as if the air had stopped moving altogether, suffocating him in its stillness. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, and it felt like the pressure in the room had increased, the walls pushing in on him from all sides. Then he heard it, a soft creak. It wasn't from above or below, but from beside him. Something shifting in the darkness. Mason whipped his head to the side, but nothing. Nothing but shadows, stretching longer and darker, pressing closer. He didn't know what to do. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to get away, but his feet remained rooted to the ground. His body wouldn't move. The pressure was too great, the weight of the room too much. Then it came again. A whisper. So faint at first that it almost seemed like a trick of the mind, but it grew louder, clearer, until Mason could hear it distinctly, the words wrapping around him like a cold hand squeezing his throat. "You're not alone?" Mason's blood ran cold. He could feel his pulse throbbing in his neck, could hear the sound of his heart beating in his ears, drowning out everything else. His eyes darted through the darkness, trying to find the source of the voice. But there was nothing. Nothing. The silence was almost worse than the sound, the stillness of the air wrapping around him, squeezing tighter with each passing second. And then, another creak star. This time it was louder. And it wasn't coming from the shadows, it was coming from directly in front of him. He could feel it now, something in the air, something invisible brushing against his skin. Something watching, waiting, lurking just out of sight. The pressure in his chest was unbearable, like a weight on his lungs, making it hard to breathe. Mason staggered back, his feet slipping on the uneven ground as his eyes shot around the space, frantic, searching. But there was nothing. No movement. No sound. Just the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. Mason's breath came in short, shallow gasps. His vision swam, the edges of the darkness shifting as if they were alive, as if they were watching him. He was surrounded. He could feel the presence growing stronger now, could feel it wrapping itself around him like a spider's web, pulling tighter with each passing second. He wanted to scream, to run, to tear himself out of this nightmare, but he couldn't move. The darkness had him, and it was suffocating him, choking the air from his lungs. He couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't breathe. But then he felt something. Something solid, something real. His hand brushed against something smooth and cold, something large. He flinched, his mind screaming for him to pull away, to run, but his fingers were already wrapped around it. A door. Mason's heart skipped a beat and his mind raced. A door. Was it his way out? Was it his salvation? It was impossible to tell, but it was something tangible. Something real. The moment his hand touched the handle, the air in the room shifted. It was subtle at first, like a small change in the wind, but it was enough to send a shock of adrenaline through his veins. He gripped the handle tighter, pulling it downward with trembling fingers. The door opened with a slow, agonizing creak. And as the light spilled out from the room beyond, Mason saw it. The hallway. The same hallway he had passed through when he first entered the house. But now something was different. There were no more whispers, no more breathing. Only the sound of his own ragged breaths filling the silence. But as Mason stepped forward, ready to leave the room, he caught a glimpse of something at the far end of the hallway. A figure. A silhouette standing motionless in the distance. And this time it wasn't just a shadow. It was a person. A person waiting for him. Mason's pulse quickened as he stared at the figure standing at the far end of the hallway. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment the entire world seemed to freeze. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just standing there, watching him. A cold chill ran down Mason's spine as he instinctively took a step backward. His heart was racing in his chest, every muscle in his body tensed, ready to run at the slightest sign of danger. But what could he run from? The figure had not moved, not made a sound. And yet, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for him, that whatever it was, it knew he was here. The air felt thick, as if it were closing in around him, the shadows in the hallway stretching further, crawling toward him with unnatural intent. His eyes remained locked on the figure, but even as he stared, he could feel the darkness moving. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the corner of his vision, a shift of light, a bending of the shadows. And then it hit him. The figure was not standing still. It was growing closer. Mason's stomach turned over as the realization hit. The figure wasn't just waiting. It was coming for him. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body wouldn't obey. His legs felt like they were made of stone, his feet rooted to the ground. The more he tried to move, the heavier his limbs felt, as though some invisible force were holding him in place. His heart was pounding in his ears now, louder than the silence, louder than the whispers that had once surrounded him. The figure was closer now. It was tall, unnaturally tall and thin, its form blurry in the dim light. Its face was obscured by shadows, a hood of some sort, but Mason could see the shape of it, thin, angular, like the bones of a corpse. The longer he stared, the more the figure seemed to distort, the more its presence seemed to grow, like it was spreading across the hallway, consuming everything in its path. No. No, please, Mason whispered, his voice breaking. His legs trembled beneath him, and he could feel the cold sweat trickling down his spine. His hands shook at his sides, and his breath came in quick, shallow gasps. The figure took another step forward. And then, with a sudden jarring motion, it lunged. Mason's instincts kicked in, and he staggered backward, his legs finally working as he pushed himself away from the advancing form. His feet slipped on the uneven floor, and he tumbled back, hitting the wall with a loud thud. His vision swam for a moment, but he forced himself to focus, to look up. The figure was gone. For a heartbeat, Mason allowed himself to breathe. The silence returned, almost deafening in its stillness. His heart was still pounding, and his hands were slick with sweat as he slowly pushed himself back to his feet, trying to steady himself. He had to get out. He had to escape whatever this was, whatever nightmare he had fallen into. There was no reason, no sense to it. It was a dream, a twisted, horrible dream. Except he knew it wasn't. This place, the house, the hallway, it was all real. And the figure was too. He didn't know how he knew it, but he did. Something deep in his gut, some primal instinct, told him that the figure wasn't just a manifestation of fear, a trick of the mind. It was something more, something alive, and it was following him. Mason pushed himself forward, his eyes darting down the hallway as he scanned for an exit, for a way out of this nightmare. But there was nothing. Just the long, empty corridor stretching ahead, shrouded in shadows. Every creak of the floor beneath him sounded amplified in the silence, and every step he took seemed to echo louder, as if the house itself was holding its breath. And then, without warning, the whispers started again. They were soft at first, but they grew louder, twisting through the air, swirling around him. The words were unintelligible at first, like distant voices muffled by a wall, but slowly they began to form. "We've been waiting." Mason's blood ran cold. He turned, desperately searching for the source of the voices, but the hallway remained as still and empty as ever. Asterisk, "You're here now." Asterisk. His hands shook as he covered his ears, trying to block out the words, trying to push away the growing sense of dread that threatened to swallow him whole. The air was growing thick again, heavy with the presence of something unseen, something malevolent. The walls felt like they were closing in, the shadows growing longer, darker, more oppressive. And then, from somewhere in the depths of the darkness, a figure appeared. It was the same figure. The tall, thin shape that had been standing at the end of the hallway. It had returned. But this time it wasn't just a shadow. This time its face was visible. The face was pale, almost deathly white, with hollow eyes that seemed to swallow the light. Its features were gaunt, almost skeletal, with sharp angles that made it look more like a mask than a face. And beneath the hood, its mouth was open, a jagged line of teeth, blackened and rotting, like the maw of some ancient creature. The thing grinned at him, its lips stretching too wide, too unnaturally, until it seemed to consume its entire face. And then it spoke. "You're too late?" The voice was not human. It was a low rasp, like gravel scraping against metal, like something old, ancient. The words seemed to crawl into his mind, seeping into his thoughts like poison. Asterisk, "What do you want from me?" Asterisk, Mason choked out, his voice barely audible above the pounding of his heart. But the figure didn't answer. It didn't need to. With a sudden, jerking motion, it raised its arm, pointing directly at him. And the shadows around Mason surged forward as if they were alive, pulling him toward the figure. Mason stumbled backward, his heart racing, but the shadows didn't release him. They clung to him, wrapping around his arms and legs like cold, unyielding chains. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The figure's grin widened, its hollow eyes never leaving him. "You've come home?" And the shadows pulled him forward, dragging him into the abyss. Mason's scream echoed into the void, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive darkness as the shadows dragged him deeper and deeper. He clawed at the ground, his fingers scraping against rough, uneven stone, but there was no escape. The cold tendrils of shadow tightened their grip, unrelenting, pulling him into an unseen abyss. His mind raced with panic, his breath ragged and sharp as the air grew heavier, thick with a suffocating pressure. His chest felt like it was collapsing in on itself, his pulse pounding in his ears. The figure's voice echoed in his mind over and over, whispering the same haunting phrase, "You've come home?" Mason didn't know how far he had been dragged when the shadows finally released him. He collapsed onto the ground, his body trembling, his hands gripping the cold, damp stone beneath him. The silence that followed was deafening, an oppressive weight pressing down on him from every direction. He pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, gasping for air, his lungs burning. The faint metallic tang of blood lingered in his mouth. He must have bitten his tongue during the struggle. He spat onto the ground, wiping his lips with the back of his hand, and forced himself to look around. The darkness was no longer complete. Ahead of him, faint lines of light flickered through cracks in the walls, casting eerie patterns that danced across the space. He was in some sort of chamber now, massive and sprawling, with stone walls covered in strange symbols carved deep into their surfaces. The carvings seemed to pulsate faintly as though alive, their glow casting an unnatural light across the room. Mason's stomach churned as he stepped closer to the nearest wall, the symbols drawing him in despite the dread coiling in his chest. He ran his fingers across the grooves, feeling the jagged lines beneath his skin. The carvings were crude, almost primal, but there was something deliberate about them, something purposeful. "What is this place?" Mason whispered, his voice barely audible in the suffocating stillness. The air seemed to shift in response to his words, a low hum reverberating through the chamber. Mason spun around, his heart pounding, but the space was empty. The shadows flickered along the edges of the room, retreating as the dim light grew stronger. And then he saw it. In the center of the chamber stood an altar, ancient and foreboding. It was carved from the same dark stone as the walls, its surface etched with more of the strange symbols. Atop it lay an object, a small blackened box no larger than a shoebox, its surface shimmering faintly in the dim light. Mason's instincts screamed at him to stay away, but his feet moved of their own accord, drawn toward the altar as if some unseen force were guiding him. He approached cautiously, his hands trembling at his sides, his breath shallow and uneven. The box seemed to pulse, its surface rippling like water, though it remained solid to the touch. Mason hesitated, his fingers hovering inches above it, the air around it cold and biting. Don't. The voice was sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. Mason jerked back, his heart racing as he spun around. Standing at the edge of the chamber was a woman, a stranger. Her face was pale, her dark hair hanging in damp, disheveled strands around her shoulders. She was dressed in tattered clothes, her eyes wide and fearful as she stared at him. Who are you?" Mason stammered, his voice trembling. The woman didn't answer immediately. Her gaze flicked to the box on the altar, her expression tightening. "You shouldn't be here," she said finally, her voice low and urgent. "None of us should be here." "What are you talking about?" Mason asked, stepping closer to her. "What is this place? What's happening to me?" The woman shook her head, her eyes darting to the shadows that still lingered at the edges of the room. "This place, it's not what it seems," she said. "It's alive. It's watching us. And that box," she broke off, her voice catching. "That box is the reason we're trapped here." Mason's eyes widened. "Trapped? What do you mean?" "The house," the woman said, her voice trembling. "It's not a house. It's a trap. A prison for something ancient, something that should never have been disturbed." Mason felt a cold knot of fear tighten in his chest. "What's in the box?" The woman's gaze locked onto his, her expression grave. "It's not what's in the box that matters," she said. "It's what the box is. A key. A seal. And if you open it..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The dread in her voice was enough. Mason took a step back, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "How do we get out of here?" The woman's expression faltered, and for a moment, Mason thought she might cry. "There is no way out," she said softly. "Not unless you want to let it out too." "What do you mean?" Mason demanded, his voice rising. "The box," the woman said. "It's the only way. But if you open it, you'll unleash what's been trapped here for centuries. It's not just the house that's cursed, it's everything tied to it. And once it's free..." Her voice trailed off, and the silence that followed was heavier than any Mason had felt before. A sudden jarring sound cut through the stillness, a low guttural growl that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Mason's head snapped toward the shadows, his blood running cold as they began to shift, moving toward him once more. The woman's eyes widened in terror. "It knows we're here," she whispered. "We have to go. Now." "But you just said there's no way out." Mason said, his voice panicked. "There's no way out for both of us," the woman said, her voice hardening. "One of us has to make a choice." Before Mason could react, the woman lunged toward the altar, her hands reaching for the box. Mason's instincts kicked in and he grabbed her arm, pulling her back with a strength he didn't know he possessed. "What are you doing?" he shouted. "I'm ending this," she screamed, struggling against him. "You don't understand, you can't let it stay sealed forever. It'll find another way." The growling grew louder, the shadows surging forward like a tidal wave, and Mason realized they were running out of time. "Wait!" Mason yelled, his voice desperate. There has to be another way, but the woman didn't listen. With a final, desperate shove, she broke free of his grip and lunged for the box. The moment her hands touched it, the entire chamber shuddered violently, the air filling with an ear-splitting roar. The shadows surged toward the altar, enveloping the woman in an instant. Her scream was cut off as the darkness consumed her, and Mason stumbled back, his eyes wide with horror. The box pulsed once, its glow intensifying, and then everything went still. Mason was alone, or so he thought. A soft voice, familiar and chilling, whispered in his ear. Asterisk, you should have let her finish? Asterisk. Mason's body froze at the sound of the whisper. The voice was intimate, close, as if it had crawled into his very mind. He spun around, his heart hammering in his chest, but the chamber was empty. No shadows. No woman. Just silence. The box on the altar pulsed faintly, its glow now dull and rhythmic, like a dying heartbeat. The carvings on the walls flickered dimly as if they too were fading. For a moment, Mason dared to hope it was over, that somehow the nightmare had ended. But then the ground beneath him began to shift. The stones trembled, cracks splintering across the floor with a loud, jagged groan. Mason stumbled, his balance thrown as the chamber quaked violently. A deep, guttural roar echoed through the space, not from any direction but from everywhere at once. The sound rattled his bones, primal and full of rage. The box on the altar began to lift, floating slowly into the air. No. No, no, no. Mason shouted, backing away as far as the walls would allow. His back pressed against the cold stone as he stared, helpless, at the box. It began to open. The lid lifted only an inch, but that was all it took. A dense, black mist poured out, swirling and expanding rapidly, filling the chamber like a living storm. The mist writhed and twisted, forming shapes. Faces, clawed hands, distorted limbs, all shifting and dissolving before Mason could process what he was seeing. The carvings on the walls flared to life again, glowing with an intense, blinding light. The chamber seemed to scream, the sound tearing through Mason's mind like nails on a chalkboard. He clutched his head, falling to his knees as the pressure mounted, unbearable. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't like before, it wasn't a whisper, soft and insidious. This was loud, thunderous, a force of nature that seemed to fill every corner of existence. Asterisk, free. Asterisk. The words reverberated through Mason's very soul, leaving him gasping for air. He forced his eyes open, staring up at the swirling mist, which had now coalesced into a towering, shapeless mass. It radiated malice, its presence a physical weight pressing down on him. Why me? Mason choked out, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. What do you want from me? The entity shifted, its form bending and twisting unnaturally as it loomed over him. Asterisk, you came to us, mortal. You stepped into our domain. You brought yourself here. Asterisk. No. Mason shouted, his voice breaking. I didn't know. I was just... The entity cut him off with a deafening roar, the chamber shaking violently once more. Asterisk, you were drawn here. As they all are. As they always will be. Asterisk. Mason's mind raced, trying to make sense of the words. Drawn here? By what? By who? The mist shifted again, coiling around the altar. The box floated back into place, its lid slamming shut with a finality that echoed through the chamber. The carvings on the walls dimmed, their light flickering like dying embers. This place was built to contain me, the entity said, its voice quieter now but no less terrifying. Asterisk, but it cannot hold me forever. Not when the living are so easily tempted by what lies within. Asterisk. The woman's words came rushing back to Mason. Asterisk, the house isn't a house. It's a trap. Asterisk, he realized now what she had meant. This place wasn't just cursed. It was bait. A lure for anyone desperate, curious, or foolish enough to venture inside. And now he had set it free. What happens now? Mason whispered, his voice trembling. The entity laughed, a sound that made Mason's skin crawl. Asterisk now? Asterisk, it said, almost mockingly. Asterisk, now you carry me. You are my vessel. Asterisk. Mason's breath caught in his throat. No. No, you can't. Before he could finish, the mist surged toward him, enveloping him completely. It was cold, impossibly cold, and it seeped into his skin, his mouth, his lungs. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His vision blurred, his body convulsing as the darkness consumed him. Memories flooded his mind, not his own, but those of the entity. He saw the house being built, the rituals performed, the sacrifices made to bind the entity within. He saw countless others who had come before him, drawn to the house, all meeting the same fate. And he saw the future, a world where the entity was no longer confined, where it spread like a plague, consuming everything in its path. Mason's body fell limp, collapsing onto the stone floor. For a long moment there was silence. Then, slowly, Mason rose to his feet. But it wasn't Mason anymore. His eyes were black, his expression blank. The box floated back to the altar, its surface glowing faintly as it sealed itself once more. The chamber began to shift, the cracks in the floor closing, the carvings dimming to nothing. The house would reset itself, ready to draw in its next victim. Mason, or what had become of him, walked toward the chamber's exit. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if testing the limits of his new body. As he reached the doorway, he turned back, his lips curling into a faint, unnatural smile. "You've come home," he said softly, his voice a perfect echo of the entity's. And then he stepped into the darkness, leaving the house waiting for its next visitor. Story 2. The forest seemed alive that night. Wind whispered through the gnarled trees, their branches clawing at the bruised sky. Fog clung to the ground like a shroud, curling and twisting as if trying to trap whatever dared to walk within. The gravel road wound like a snake through the darkness, and at its end stood a solitary house. David's headlights flickered as the car rattled up the narrow path, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter than he realized. The rain was relentless, drumming against the windshield, and the wipers squeaked as they struggled to keep up. He hadn't meant to take this route. Hell, he hadn't even planned to be here. A wrong turn, a faulty GPS, and now he was in the middle of nowhere, searching for some semblance of civilization. The house came into view suddenly, looming out of the fog like a predator waiting to pounce. It was old, its wooden exterior weathered and warped by years of neglect. The windows were dark, their glass panes reflecting the occasional flash of lightning. A chill crept down David's spine as he parked in the overgrown driveway. Just for a minute, he muttered to himself, shutting off the engine. Just to see if someone's home. Maybe they have a phone. The moment he stepped out of the car, the oppressive silence hit him. The rain muffled all sound, but even so, there was something unnervingly still about the place. No distant hum of wildlife, no rustle of leaves, just the sound of his own breathing and the crunch of gravel under his boots. David approached the front door, his pulse quickening. The porch creaked under his weight, and he hesitated, one hand hovering over the tarnished brass knocker. Something about the house felt wrong. But desperation won out over caution. He rapped 3 times. The sound echoed unnaturally loud as if the house itself were hollow. He waited, shifting from foot to foot. A minute passed, then 2. No answer. David sighed, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Hello?" he called, his voice breaking the silence. "Anyone home?" The door groaned as it swung inward. He hadn't touched it. He froze, heart hammering. The interior was dark, the air inside carrying the faint smell of damp wood and something else, something metallic. "What?" "Hello?" he called again, his voice trembling now. No response. Against his better judgment, David stepped inside. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath his weight, each step sending a shiver up his spine. He fumbled for his phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper and furniture draped in white sheets. Dust motes danced in the air, disturbed by his intrusion. The living room was cavernous, the shadows stretching and shifting with every movement of his light. A grandfather clock stood against one wall, its pendulum motionless. It hadn't worked in years, judging by the thick layer of dust. A painting hung above the fireplace, a family portrait, the faces faded and cracked. Something about their expressions made his stomach churn. The eyes, though lifeless, seemed to follow him. "Get a grip," he whispered to himself. "It's just an old house." But it wasn't. He knew it in his bones. Something lingered here, something unseen but palpable. The air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken warning. "You should leave." No. His light landed on a staircase at the far end of the room. The banister was intricately carved, the wood polished and untouched by time, unlike the rest of the house. He swallowed hard, debating whether to explore further. Logic told him to turn around and walk back to his car, but a strange compulsion urged him forward. It was as if the house was drawing him in, whispering promises of answers to questions he hadn't yet asked. He placed one foot on the bottom step, and that's when he heard it, a faint creak coming from upstairs. He froze, the beam of his flashlight shaking. It could have been the house settling, or a rat, but deep down he knew better. "Hello?" he called out for the 3rd time, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence answered him. The creak came again, louder this time. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like footsteps. His chest tightened as he stared up the staircase, his imagination conjuring images of what might be waiting for him in the darkness. He took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run. And then he saw it. A shadow moved at the top of the stairs, just barely visible in the dim light. It was human-shaped but wrong, its movements jerky and unnatural. David's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move, couldn't think. The shadow paused, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. A loud crash shattered the silence, coming from somewhere behind him. He whipped around, his flashlight darting across the room. Nothing. Just the same empty furniture, the same oppressive darkness. But the sound had been real. It had come from the kitchen. "Get out," he whispered to himself, panic rising. "Get out now." But his feet wouldn't obey. It was as if the house had rooted him in place, its unseen tendrils wrapping around his limbs. The shadow at the top of the stairs moved again, descending one step at a time. Slowly, deliberately. David's heart raced as he backed toward the door, his flashlight trained on the figure. It stopped midway down the stairs, just out of reach of the light. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, it spoke. "Why did you come here?" David stumbled, the words slicing through him like a blade. His back hit the door and he fumbled for the handle. The figure began to move again, faster now, its distorted form gliding down the steps. He yanked the door open and bolted outside, the rain slapping against his face as he sprinted to his car. The engine roared to life and he threw the car into reverse, gravel spraying as he sped down the driveway. He didn't dare look back, not until he was miles away, the house nothing more than a memory. But as the car hurtled down the empty road, a single thought nagged at the edge of his mind. The voice. It had sounded familiar. And in the rearview mirror, just for a second, he thought he saw something sitting in the backseat. Something that shouldn't be there. The storm had chased David down the road, relentless and unyielding. The rain battered the windshield, and the wipers, though working overtime, struggled to clear his view. The gravel road stretched endlessly before him, hemmed in by the twisted arms of trees that seemed to lean closer with every mile. David's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his breaths coming fast and shallow. He glanced in the rearview mirror again. Nothing. The back seat was empty. He was sure of it this time. And yet, the voice still echoed in his head. "Why did you come here?" It didn't make sense. It wasn't just the words, it was the way they were spoken, the way they cut through him. Like an accusation. Like a threat. And most unsettling of all, like a memory. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, startling him. He glanced down, his pulse spiking, but the screen remained dark. No call, no notification. Just a phantom vibration that made his stomach twist. He reached for the phone anyway, his hand trembling, and pressed the button to wake the screen. No signal. Of course. The car jolted as one of the tires hit a pothole, and David swore, gripping the wheel tighter. He forced his eyes back on the road, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. He needed to focus. He needed to find a gas station or a diner or any sign of life. Anywhere but here. The headlights illuminated a rusted metal sign up ahead, its paint chipped and faded. He slowed as he approached, squinting through the rain to make out the words. Cold Creek Hollow, 5 miles. David frowned. He didn't remember seeing that on the map earlier, but then again he hadn't exactly been paying attention. He had just been trying to get home, his mind elsewhere, consumed by the argument he'd had with Sarah that morning. Her voice echoed in his head now, sharp and biting. "You're always running, David. Always looking for a way out." He shook the thought away. This wasn't the time for regrets. He had bigger problems now, like figuring out where the hell he was and how to get back to civilization. Cold Creek Hollow didn't sound promising, but it was better than driving aimlessly through the storm. He turned the wheel, the car groaning in protest as it veered onto the narrow road leading to the town. The trees closed in tighter here, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out what little light remained. The rain was lighter now, reduced to a steady drizzle, but the fog had thickened, swallowing the car in a gray haze. David's headlights barely cut through it, and he found himself leaning forward, his eyes straining to see the road. He almost didn't notice the figure until it was too late. It appeared suddenly, materializing out of the fog like a ghost. David slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the wet asphalt as the car screeched to a halt. His heart pounded as he stared out the windshield, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. The figure was standing in the middle of the road, unmoving. A man, or at least the silhouette of one. He was tall and thin, his clothes hanging off him like rags. His face was obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but there was something off about his posture, the way he stood so still, so rigid. David hesitated, his instincts warring with his curiosity. He rolled down the window a crack, the cold air rushing in and making him shiver. "Hey, you okay?" he called out, his voice louder than he intended. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. Just stood there, staring, or at least David thought he was staring. It was hard to tell with the hat casting his face in darkness. David's stomach churned. Something about the man felt wrong. He couldn't explain it, but the air around him seemed heavier now, the fog thicker. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 9:47 p.m. He wasn't sure why he noted the time, but something about the moment felt significant. Final. The figure tilted his head slightly, the movement so sudden and unnatural that David flinched. He rolled the window back up, his hands shaking as he reached for the gear shift. But before he could put the car in reverse, the man moved. It wasn't a walk. It wasn't even a run. It was more like a lurch, a jerky, spasmodic movement that brought him closer to the car in the blink of an eye. David gasped, his body tensing as the figure's face came into view, or rather, the lack of it. Where the man's face should have been, there was nothing. Just a smooth, featureless expanse of pale skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just blankness. David's mind rebelled against the sight, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. He slammed the car into reverse, his foot punching the gas pedal. The tires screeched as the car shot backward, the figure disappearing into the fog once more. David didn't stop until he was sure he was far enough away, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. He turned the wheel, the car spinning slightly as he maneuvered back onto the main road. Cold Creek Hollow was no longer an option. He didn't care if it was the only town for miles, he wasn't going anywhere near it. He just needed to keep driving, to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever that thing was. But the road didn't seem to agree. No matter how far he drove, the trees remained the same, the fog unrelenting. He checked the clock again. 9:47 p.m. His blood ran cold. That couldn't be right. He'd been driving for at least 10 minutes, maybe more. He checked his phone again. Still no signal. The battery icon was flashing now, a cruel reminder of how little time he had left before he'd be completely cut off. He tossed the phone back onto the passenger seat, his frustration mounting. The road curved suddenly, and David cursed as he struggled to maintain control of the car. When he straightened out, he saw it, the sign. Cold Creek Hollow, 5 miles. "No," he whispered, his grip on the wheel tightening. "No, that's not possible." He hit the gas, the car roaring as it sped down the road. The trees blurred past him, the fog thickening until it felt like he was driving through a cloud. He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched, his mind racing. This couldn't be happening. It didn't make sense. And then, just as suddenly as before, the figure appeared again. This time, David didn't stop. He hit the gas, the car hurtling toward the silhouette. His pulse pounded in his ears as the car passed through the figure as if it wasn't there. The temperature inside the vehicle plummeted, his breath fogging up the windshield. The car skidded to a stop on the side of the road, David's chest heaving as he gripped the wheel. He didn't look back. He didn't want to know if the figure was still there. But in the silence, a sound emerged. Soft at first, almost imperceptible. A whisper. "Why did you come here?" This time it was coming from inside the car. The whisper hung in the air, curling around David like a cold hand wrapping around his throat. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His trembling hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles bone white as his chest heaved for air. The voice was inside the car, a rasping, guttural sound that made his skin crawl. "Why did you come here?" Slowly, as if moving too fast would break whatever fragile thread kept him tethered to sanity, David turned his head. The rearview mirror caught his eye, but he didn't dare look at it. Not yet. The whisper came again, louder now, almost insistent. "Why did you come here?" His eyes flicked up to the mirror. There was nothing. The back seat was empty, just as it had been moments ago. David exhaled a shaky breath, his head pounding with adrenaline. His hands released the steering wheel for a moment, and he wiped his damp palms on his jeans. He was losing it. That had to be it. The storm, the long drive, the strange house. It was messing with his head. But then came the sound. It started as a faint creak, like leather shifting, and grew louder, a slow, deliberate movement coming from the back seat. David's breath caught in his throat. He turned his head, his body trembling as he forced himself to look. The back seat wasn't empty anymore. Sitting there, in the dim light of the dashboard, was a figure. Its shape was distorted, shrouded in shadows that seemed to flicker and twist like they were alive. Its face, or what should have been a face, was smooth and featureless, pale as bone. It leaned forward slightly, and though it had no eyes, David felt its gaze pierce through him, cold and invasive. He scrambled for the door handle, his fingers fumbling against the metal. The figure didn't move. It just sat there, silent and still, waiting. David shoved the door open and stumbled out into the rain, his legs shaky beneath him. He tripped on the wet asphalt and landed hard, the impact jarring but distant, like his body was numb to the pain. The rain soaked him instantly, plastering his clothes to his skin and stinging his face. He turned back to the car, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure was gone. The back seat was empty again, the interior of the car dark and quiet. David's pulse raced, his mind spinning. He didn't know what to do. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, a black ribbon swallowed by the fog. The forest loomed around him, its trees gnarled and twisted like they were watching, waiting. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, the screen flickering to life. No signal. The battery icon blinked red, 5% left. He tried dialing anyway, punching in Sarah's number with shaky fingers. The line didn't connect. "Come on," he muttered, his voice cracking. "Come on, damn it." A faint hum filled the air, so low it was almost imperceptible. At first, David thought it was the sound of blood rushing in his ears, but it grew louder, more distinct. It was a vibration, a pulsing rhythm that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. And then he heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching against the wet gravel, coming from behind him. David froze, his heart thundering in his chest. He didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see what was there. The footsteps grew closer. He spun around, his phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam wavered as his hand trembled, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road and the fog that seemed to press in on him from all sides. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice echoing into the void. Silence. David's breathing was ragged now, his chest tight with panic. He stepped backward toward the car, his eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. He was about to climb back inside when the voice returned, soft and insidious, like it was whispering directly into his ear. "You can't leave." David spun around again, his flashlight sweeping across the road. The figure was there, standing just a few feet away now. Its body was unnaturally still, its head tilted slightly to the side as if studying him. "What do you want?" David demanded, his voice shaking. "Why are you doing this?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one hand, its fingers long and thin, almost skeletal. It pointed toward the trees, the movement slow and deliberate. David followed the direction of its gesture, his flashlight landing on a narrow path that wound into the forest. The trail was overgrown, the underbrush thick and uninviting. He shook his head, backing away. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm not going in there." The figure took a step forward. David stumbled back, his heart racing. He climbed into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. His hands fumbled with the keys, jamming them into the ignition. The engine sputtered but didn't start. "Come on," he pleaded, twisting the key again. The engine roared to life, and he punched the gas, the tires spinning on the wet road before catching traction. The car shot forward, the figure disappearing into the fog behind him. David didn't stop. He didn't look back. He drove as fast as the slick road would allow, the trees blurring past him. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly they ached, his jaw clenched as he tried to block out the voice still echoing in his head. "You can't leave." The sign appeared again, illuminated by his headlights. Cold Creek Hollow, 5 miles. David slammed on the brakes, his stomach sinking. He stared at the sign, his mind reeling. It wasn't possible. He had been driving for miles. He should have been far away by now. The fog thickened, swallowing the road ahead. David's headlights barely penetrated the haze, and he realized with a sinking feeling that the forest seemed different. The trees were closer now, their twisted branches reaching across the road like skeletal hands. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 9:47 p.m. David's breath hitched. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "No, no, no." The whisper came again, soft and mocking. "You can't leave." The engine sputtered, and the car jerked to a stop. David slammed his hands against the wheel, a scream of frustration tearing from his throat. He grabbed his phone, the screen lighting up one last time before the battery died. There was no signal, but there was a message. One line written across the screen in bold letters. "Welcome home." David stared at the words, his blood running cold. And then, from the depths of the fog, came the sound of footsteps. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate and measured, like someone, or something, was taking its time. David sat frozen in the driver's seat, gripping the dead phone in one hand and the steering wheel in the other. His mind was screaming at him to move, to get out of the car, to run, but his body wouldn't obey. He stared into the fog, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The sound stopped. Silence fell over the road, thick and suffocating. David strained his ears, his heart pounding in his chest. He told himself it was over, that whatever had been out there was gone, but deep down he knew better. The air was still heavy, oppressive, like the world was holding its breath. And then came the knock. It was soft, almost polite, like someone tapping their knuckles against the door. It came from the driver's side window. David jerked his head toward the sound, his stomach lurching. The fog pressed against the glass, dense and impenetrable. He couldn't see anything beyond it, but the knock came again, louder this time. His hand moved on its own, reaching for the door handle, but he stopped himself at the last second. What was he doing? Opening the door was the last thing he should do. The knock turned into a scrape, a long, grating sound like nails dragging across the glass. David flinched, his pulse racing as the sound cut through the silence. He forced himself to look, his breath catching in his throat. A face was pressed against the window, or rather what should have been a face. It was smooth and pale, featureless except for the faint indentations where eyes and a mouth might have been. The thing tilted its head, the movement slow and unnatural, as if it were trying to see him better. David recoiled, his back pressing against the passenger seat. His mind screamed at him to do something, anything, but his body refused to move. He was trapped, paralyzed by fear. The thing raised a hand, its fingers long and spindly, and tapped the glass with one crooked nail. The sound was sharp, like a needle pricking his skin. "Why did you come here?" the voice whispered, though the thing had no mouth. David shook his head, his breaths coming in short, panicked bursts. "I don't know," he stammered. "I didn't mean to. I'm just trying to leave." The thing tilted its head the other way, its blank face eerily calm. "You can't leave." David's hands fumbled for the keys, still in the ignition. He twisted them desperately, the engine sputtering but refusing to start. "Come on," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "Please just start." The thing's hand pressed against the glass now, its fingers splayed out like it was testing the barrier between them. The glass groaned under the pressure, tiny cracks spiderwebbing out from where its hand rested. David slammed his foot on the gas pedal, willing the car to start, and this time the engine roared to life. Without thinking, he threw the car into drive and slammed on the accelerator. The tires screeched, the car lurching forward as the thing disappeared into the fog behind him. He didn't look back. The road stretched out before him, endless and unchanging. The fog seemed thicker now, the trees pressing closer, their branches clawing at the car as he sped past. David gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles aching. He had no plan, no idea where he was going, he just knew he had to get away. The headlights caught something up ahead, a sign. Cold Creek Hollow, 5 miles. David screamed, slamming the brakes. The car skidded to a stop and he stared at the sign, his chest heaving. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, no, no. This can't be happening." He was going in circles. It didn't matter how far he drove or how fast, he always ended up back here. David slammed his fists against the steering wheel, a guttural cry of frustration tearing from his throat. He felt like a rat in a maze, trapped and powerless. The radio crackled to life, the static filling the car. David froze, his heart skipping a beat. The dial turned on its own, the needle sliding across the numbers until it landed on a station. A voice came through, soft and distorted, like it was speaking from underwater. "You can't leave." David's hands flew to the radio, twisting the knob in a desperate attempt to turn it off, but the voice continued. "You can't run from this, David. You know that." His breath hitched. The voice knew his name. "Who are you?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the static grew louder, filling the car with an ear-splitting screech. David covered his ears, his eyes squeezed shut as the sound threatened to split his head open. And then it stopped. Silence fell once more, heavy and absolute. David opened his eyes, his chest heaving. The fog outside the car had cleared slightly, revealing the path that wound into the forest. The same path the thing had pointed to earlier. David's stomach churned. He didn't want to go into the forest. Every instinct screamed at him to stay away, but what choice did he have? The road was a dead end, a loop that kept bringing him back to the same place. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. "Okay," he muttered to himself. "Okay, fine. You want me to go in there? I'll go." but this ends tonight. He turned the car toward the path, the tires crunching over the gravel. The trees seemed to close in around him as he drove, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The air grew colder and the oppressive weight returned, pressing down on him like a physical force. The headlights illuminated something up ahead, a structure hidden among the trees. It was a house, or what was left of one. The roof sagged, the windows were shattered, and the walls were covered in ivy and moss. David stopped the car, his heart pounding. The house felt wrong. It radiated an energy that made his skin crawl, but he couldn't turn back now. He stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at his skin. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that felt alive, like it was watching him. The front door of the house was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. David hesitated, his feet rooted to the ground. And then he heard it. A soft, lilting hum coming from inside the house. It was a tune he recognized, one he hadn't heard in years. It was a lullaby, the same one his mother used to sing to him when he was a child. His blood ran cold. "Come inside, David," the voice whispered, soft and inviting. The door creaked open wider, revealing the darkness within. David's feet moved on their own, carrying him toward the house. And as he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him. Chapter 5. The slam of the door reverberated through the decrepit house, echoing like a gunshot in the suffocating silence. David whipped around, grabbing the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The wood felt icy under his palm, as though the house itself was alive, feeding on his fear. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. The sound bounced back to him, warped and distorted, as if the house was mocking him. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, mingling with something metallic and sharp, like rust or blood. David's flashlight beam danced erratically across the room, illuminating peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and stains that seeped into the rotting floorboards. The hum started again, soft and melodic, like the lullaby his mother used to sing. It seemed to come from deeper inside the house, luring him forward. "Mom?" The word slipped from his lips before he could stop it, and his voice cracked under the weight of it. He felt foolish the moment he said it, but something about that tune pulled at a deep, buried part of him, a part he thought he'd left behind. The house groaned, its walls shuddering as if they were breathing. David's chest tightened as he took a hesitant step forward. The floor creaked ominously beneath his weight, threatening to give way at any moment. He shone the flashlight toward the hallway. The beam illuminated a long corridor lined with doors, each one slightly ajar. The hum grew louder, echoing off the walls, but it wasn't coming from any particular direction. It seemed to emanate from the very house itself. "Hello?" he tried again, his voice barely above a whisper. A door at the far end of the hallway creaked open wider, revealing nothing but inky darkness beyond. David hesitated. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to get out while he still could, but his feet moved of their own accord, drawing him closer to the door. The walls seemed to close in around him as he walked, the hallway narrowing with every step. The air grew colder, each breath fogging in front of him. He reached the door, his hand trembling as he pushed it open. The room beyond was small and bare, the walls covered in faded, floral wallpaper. In the center of the room was a rocking chair, its back turned to him. It swayed gently, the rhythmic creak of wood against wood in perfect time with the lullaby. "Mom?" David's voice was barely audible, choked by the lump in his throat. The rocking chair stopped. David froze, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against his ears like a physical force. Slowly, the chair began to turn, the sound of its legs scraping against the floor grating and deliberate. But there was no one in the chair. David's stomach lurched, his skin prickling with cold sweat. The chair rocked forward once more and then stopped completely, as if whatever had been there was now standing directly in front of him. The flashlight flickered. "David." The voice was soft, almost tender, but it came from behind him. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was closer now, whispered directly into his ear. David stumbled backward, tripping over the rocking chair and landing hard on the floor. His flashlight rolled out of his hand, its beam spinning wildly across the room before settling on the far corner. A figure stood there, its body shrouded in shadows. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs long and angular like a marionette. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, and though its face was hidden, David felt its eyes on him, piercing and unrelenting. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing the flashlight and backing toward the door. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to warp, the shadows pulsing and twisting like they were alive. "Stay away from me," David warned, his voice trembling. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was being controlled by invisible strings. The shadows clung to it, swirling around its body as it advanced. David bolted, his legs carrying him down the hallway and back toward the front door. He yanked at the doorknob again, desperate to escape, but it still wouldn't budge. The hum grew louder, more insistent, filling his ears and drowning out his thoughts. He turned toward the staircase that spiraled upward into the darkness. It was the only other way to go. The wooden steps groaned under his weight as he climbed, each one threatening to collapse beneath him. The hum followed him, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was vibrating inside his skull. He reached the top of the stairs and found himself in another hallway, identical to the one below. The doors here were all closed, their paint peeling and flaking onto the floor. A low, guttural growl echoed from behind one of the doors. David froze, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't want to open any of them, but the growl came again, louder this time, followed by a scratching sound like claws raking against wood. The door at the end of the hall burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that shook the house. David's flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. "No, no, no," he muttered, smacking the flashlight against his palm in a desperate attempt to bring it back to life. Something moved in the darkness, a shadow shifting just at the edge of his vision. The hum stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, unnatural silence. David felt it before he saw it, a presence, cold and malevolent, standing just inches away from him. A hand brushed against his shoulder, and he whipped around, his flashlight flickering back to life just in time to illuminate the thing standing behind him. Its face was smooth and featureless, but its head was tilted downward as if staring directly at him. Its arms hung limply at its sides, its fingers long and clawed. David screamed, stumbling backward and falling to the floor. The thing stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate as though savoring his fear. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice cracking. The thing paused, its head tilting slightly to the side. "You brought this on yourself," it whispered, its voice a chorus of overlapping tones that made David's skin crawl. The floor beneath him creaked and groaned, and before he could react, it gave way entirely. David plunged into the darkness, the air ripped from his lungs as he fell. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring and disorienting. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to his feet, clutching the flashlight tightly. He was back in the first room, the rocking chair still and silent. But the door was open now, revealing the forest beyond. The voice came again, soft and mocking. "Run." David didn't hesitate. He bolted out of the house and into the trees, the cold air stinging his lungs as he ran. But even as he fled, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house, and whatever was inside it, wasn't done with him yet. The slam of the door reverberated through the decrepit house, echoing like a gunshot in the suffocating silence. David whipped around, grabbing the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The wood felt icy under his palm, as though the house itself was alive, feeding on his fear. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. The sound bounced back to him, warped and distorted, as if the house was mocking him. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, mingling with something metallic and sharp, like rust or blood. David's flashlight beam danced erratically across the room, illuminating peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and stains that seeped into the rotting floorboards. The hum started again, soft and melodic, like the lullaby his mother used to sing. It seemed to come from deeper inside the house, luring him forward. "Mom?" The word slipped from his lips before he could stop it, and his voice cracked under the weight of it. He felt foolish the moment he said it, but something about that tune pulled at a deep, buried part of him, a part he thought he'd left behind. The house groaned, its walls shuddering as if they were breathing. David's chest tightened as he took a hesitant step forward. The floor creaked ominously beneath his weight, threatening to give way at any moment. He shone the flashlight toward the hallway. The beam illuminated a long corridor lined with doors, each one slightly ajar. The hum grew louder, echoing off the walls, but it wasn't coming from any particular direction. It seemed to emanate from the very house itself. "Hello?" he tried again, his voice barely above a whisper. A door at the far end of the hallway creaked open wider, revealing nothing but inky darkness beyond. David hesitated. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to get out while he still could, but his feet moved of their own accord, drawing him closer to the door. The walls seemed to close in around him as he walked, the hallway narrowing with every step. The air grew colder, each breath fogging in front of him. He reached the door, his hand trembling as he pushed it open. The room beyond was small and bare, the walls covered in faded, floral wallpaper. In the center of the room was a rocking chair, its back turned to him. It swayed gently, the rhythmic creak of wood against wood in perfect time with the lullaby. "Mom?" David's voice was barely audible, choked by the lump in his throat. The rocking chair stopped. David froze, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against his ears like a physical force. Slowly, the chair began to turn, the sound of its legs scraping against the floor grating and deliberate. But there was no one in the chair. David's stomach lurched, his skin prickling with cold sweat. The chair rocked forward once more and then stopped completely, as if whatever had been there was now standing directly in front of him. The flashlight flickered. "David." The voice was soft, almost tender, but it came from behind him. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was closer now, whispered directly into his ear. David stumbled backward, tripping over the rocking chair and landing hard on the floor. His flashlight rolled out of his hand, its beam spinning wildly across the room before settling on the far corner. A figure stood there, its body shrouded in shadows. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs long and angular like a marionette. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, and though its face was hidden, David felt its eyes on him, piercing and unrelenting. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing the flashlight and backing toward the door. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to warp, the shadows pulsing and twisting like they were alive. "Stay away from me," David warned, his voice trembling. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was being controlled by invisible strings. The shadows clung to it, swirling around its body as it advanced. David bolted, his legs carrying him down the hallway and back toward the front door. He yanked at the doorknob again, desperate to escape, but it still wouldn't budge. The hum grew louder, more insistent, filling his ears and drowning out his thoughts. He turned toward the staircase that spiraled upward into the darkness. It was the only other way to go. The wooden steps groaned under his weight as he climbed, each one threatening to collapse beneath him. The hum followed him, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was vibrating inside his skull. He reached the top of the stairs and found himself in another hallway, identical to the one below. The doors here were all closed, their paint peeling and flaking onto the floor. A low, guttural growl echoed from behind one of the doors. David froze, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't want to open any of them, but the growl came again, louder this time, followed by a scratching sound like claws raking against wood. The door at the end of the hall burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that shook the house. David's flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. "No, no, no," he muttered, smacking the flashlight against his palm in a desperate attempt to bring it back to life. Something moved in the darkness, a shadow shifting just at the edge of his vision. The hum stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, unnatural silence. David felt it before he saw it, a presence, cold and malevolent, standing just inches away from him. A hand brushed against his shoulder, and he whipped around, his flashlight flickering back to life just in time to illuminate the thing standing behind him. Its face was smooth and featureless, but its head was tilted downward, as if staring directly at him. Its arms hung limply at its sides, its fingers long and clawed. David screamed, stumbling backward and falling to the floor. The thing stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring his fear. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice cracking. The thing paused, its head tilting slightly to the side. "You brought this on yourself," it whispered, its voice a chorus of overlapping tones that made David's skin crawl. The floor beneath him creaked and groaned, and before he could react, it gave way entirely. David plunged into the darkness, the air ripped from his lungs as he fell. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring and disorienting. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to his feet, clutching the flashlight tightly. He was back in the first room, the rocking chair still and silent. But the door was open now, revealing the forest beyond. The voice came again, soft and mocking. "Run." David didn't hesitate. He bolted out of the house and into the trees, the cold air stinging his lungs as he ran. But even as he fled, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house, and whatever was inside it, wasn't done with him yet. The forest swallowed David whole, its towering trees pressing in on him like the ribs of some great beast. The fog had thickened again, curling around his ankles and clawing up his legs as he ran. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one burning in his chest. Branches whipped against his face, tearing at his skin and clothes, but he didn't care. All that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between himself and the house. But no matter how far he ran, the forest seemed endless. The trees stretched on forever, their gnarled limbs twisting together to form a canopy that blotted out the moonlight. The air was colder here, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something faintly metallic. David's legs ached, his muscles screaming for him to stop, but he pushed on. He didn't dare look back. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the forest fell silent. David slowed to a stop, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The only sound was the pounding of his own heart in his ears. He turned in a slow circle, the flashlight beam cutting through the fog. The trees loomed around him, their twisted trunks like ancient sentinels. But something was wrong. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was dead. No rustling leaves. No chirping crickets. Not even the distant call of an owl. "Hello?" David called out, his voice hoarse. The words seemed to fall flat, swallowed by the oppressive silence. He took a step forward, the crunch of leaves underfoot startlingly loud in the stillness. And that's when he saw it. Ahead of him, just visible through the fog, was a shape. At first, he thought it was another tree, but as he drew closer, he realized it was something else entirely. A swing set. David stopped in his tracks, his stomach twisting. It was old and rusted, the chains creaking softly as the swing swayed in an invisible breeze. The sight of it sent a jolt of recognition through him, a memory clawing its way to the surface. This wasn't just any swing set. He knew this swing set. It was from his childhood. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But it was. The swing set sat in the middle of a clearing, surrounded by overgrown grass and wildflowers. Beyond it, he could just make out the faint outline of a house. A different house, but one that was no less familiar. It was his childhood home. David's legs moved on their own, carrying him toward the house. The closer he got, the more vivid the memories became. The creak of the porch steps, the smell of his mother's cooking wafting from the kitchen, the sound of his father's voice calling him in for dinner. But those memories were old and faded, like photographs left too long in the sun. They didn't belong here. The house looked exactly as it had when he was a child, down to the peeling white paint and the crooked shutters. But something was wrong. The windows were dark, and the front door hung open, revealing nothing but blackness beyond. The air around it felt heavy, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of David's neck stand on end. He didn't want to go inside, but he couldn't stop himself. His feet carried him up the porch steps and through the open door. The interior of the house was exactly as he remembered it. The worn carpet, the floral wallpaper, the old sofa in the living room. But it was all wrong. The colors were muted, the furniture coated in a fine layer of dust. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something far more putrid, like meat left out to rot. "Mom?" David called out, his voice trembling. No answer. He stepped further into the house, his footsteps muffled by the carpet. The living room was empty, but he could feel something watching him, its gaze heavy and unrelenting. The hum started again, faint and distant, coming from upstairs. David's stomach turned. He didn't want to follow it, but he knew he had no choice. The stairs groaned under his weight as he ascended, each step feeling like it might give way at any moment. The hum grew louder, more insistent, pulling him toward the second floor. At the top of the stairs, he found himself in a narrow hallway lined with doors. Most of them were closed, but one at the far end stood slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out into the hallway. David approached it slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The door creaked open as he reached it, revealing a room bathed in an eerie, flickering light. It was his bedroom. The walls were lined with shelves filled with toys and books, just as they had been when he was a child. The bed was neatly made, the quilt his mother had sewn for him draped over it. But in the center of the room stood a figure. It was a woman, her back to him. Her hair was long and dark, falling in tangled waves down her back. She wore a tattered dress, the fabric stained and torn. "Mom?" David's voice was barely more than a whisper. The woman turned slowly, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette on strings. Her face was wrong. It was his mother's face, but it was twisted and distorted, her eyes hollow and empty, her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "You came back," she said, her voice a mixture of his mother's and something else entirely, something darker. David stumbled backward, his flashlight slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. "This isn't real," he said, his voice shaking. "You're not real." The thing that wore his mother's face tilted its head, the grin widening. "Everything here is real, David," it said, "including the truth you've tried so hard to forget." The room began to warp and twist, the walls closing in around him. The shelves fell, the toys and books spilling onto the floor as the bed dissolved into shadow. The figure advanced on him, its movements fluid and inhuman. David scrambled backward, his hands searching for anything he could use to defend himself. "You left us," it said, its voice rising to a screech. "You ran away." "No," David shouted, his back hitting the wall. "I didn't." "You did," the thing hissed, its face inches from his now. "And now it's time to face what you left behind." The floor gave way beneath him and he fell again, plunging into the darkness. David's body hit the cold, hard floor with a sickening thud, the breath knocked from his lungs. He lay there, gasping, struggling to regain his bearings. The world around him was dark, unnaturally so, and the air was thick, suffocating. For a moment he wondered if he had died. Maybe this was some purgatory, some twisted version of reality that had come to claim him. But no, he wasn't dead. He was still here in this godforsaken place. He pushed himself up, his hands trembling as they scraped across the jagged floor. Where was he? He blinked hard, trying to clear the fog from his mind, and then he saw it. The faint glow of the flashlight, lying just ahead, its beam pointing upward and casting long shadows across the room. The air around it shimmered, as if the light itself was struggling to survive in the oppressive darkness. David crawled toward it, his fingers brushing the cold surface of the floor, his mind buzzing with static. He picked it up and turned it on, the beam slicing through the void. The room was unfamiliar. It wasn't his bedroom anymore. There were no toys, no bed, no familiar wallpaper. This room was larger, its high ceiling lost in the darkness above. The walls were stone, ancient and weathered, covered in strange symbols that pulsed faintly as if alive. David's pulse quickened. The air was stifling, thick with the scent of dampness and decay. It felt like a tomb, a place where time itself had forgotten to exist. He stood, his legs unsteady beneath him, and turned in a slow circle, his flashlight scanning the space. At the far end of the room, there was a door, cracked open just enough to reveal a sliver of dim light beyond. It beckoned him forward. But before he could move, he heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl, reverberating from somewhere in the darkness. It came from all directions, vibrating through the very walls, until it felt as though the room itself was alive, breathing. David's heart slammed against his ribs. He wasn't alone. The growl grew louder, deeper, as though something was emerging from the darkness, drawn toward him. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twitch and shift, pooling like liquid blackness. David took a step back, his feet stumbling over the uneven floor. His breath came faster, ragged, panic rising in his chest. He couldn't see anything clearly, but the feeling of being hunted, of being trapped, was unmistakable. Then something moved. It was a figure, tall and thin, its limbs long and spindly, its body hunched as if it were crawling on all fours. It emerged from the darkness with slow, deliberate movements, its body stretching and contorting unnaturally. David's mouth went dry. The thing was humanoid, but not entirely human. Its skin was ashen, stretched taut over sharp bones, and its eyes were wide and unblinking, black pools of nothingness that seemed to draw him in. The figure moved toward him with a strange fluidity, like it was gliding over the floor. David didn't think. He ran. His legs burned as he sprinted toward the door at the far end of the room, but it was as if the space itself had changed. The door was no longer within reach. It seemed to stretch farther away with every step, like the room was closing in on him. He looked over his shoulder, the shadows pursuing him, and that's when he saw it. The thing was gaining on him, its limbs snapping into place like a grotesque puppet, its twisted face smiling in that cold, empty way. David pushed harder, his lungs screaming for air, his body crying out for relief. His foot caught on a stone protrusion from the floor, sending him sprawling forward. His hands scraped across the cold stone as he tried to break his fall. The growl came again, louder this time, accompanied by a hiss that vibrated in his bones. David's pulse thundered in his ears, but he forced himself to push through the panic. He couldn't stop now. His hand found the edge of the door frame, and he yanked it open, tumbling through into the room beyond. The room was small and dimly lit, the faint light coming from a single bulb that swung in the center of the ceiling. It flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was littered with old, broken furniture. David slammed the door behind him, pressing his back against it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The door rattled as something on the other side slammed against it, but it held firm. For a moment there was silence. David stood there, trying to steady his breathing, his hand clutching his chest as his heart threatened to burst. Then he heard the voice, a soft whisper barely audible. David? He froze, his blood running cold. The voice was familiar but wrong. His name slipped out of the darkness again, more insistent this time. David? He turned toward the source of the voice, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The room was empty. But there, in the corner, was something he hadn't seen before. A mirror. David stepped toward it, his legs heavy, his body trembling with dread. The mirror was large, framed in dark wood, its surface cracked and warped. He stared into it. At first, he thought it was his own reflection staring back at him. But then, the face in the mirror shifted, its features twisting and distorting until it no longer resembled him at all. It was a woman, his mother. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes sunken deep into her skull, and her lips curled into that same twisted, cruel smile. "No," David whispered, his heart pounding in his throat. The reflection of his mother reached out, her fingers pressing against the glass as though trying to break free. "Why did you leave me?" she hissed, her voice no longer his mother's, but something darker, more ancient. "You can't run from the past, David." David staggered backward, his hand flying to his mouth to stifle a scream. The reflection didn't stop. It pressed forward, its face twisting, its eyes growing larger, darker, until they consumed the entire mirror. And then the glass shattered. Shards of it flew out in all directions, cutting into David's skin, drawing blood. He screamed, falling backward into the room, his hand clutching at his face. The room was silent again. But now something was different. The air was colder, the darkness deeper, and the whispering had begun again, this time from all around him. "David?" The room closed in around him, the air thick with the scent of blood and dust. The darkness seemed to press against his skin, as if it had substance, as if it could suffocate him. His hands trembled, slick with sweat, his heart racing like a drumbeat in his chest. The whispering surrounded him, 1,000 voices, all calling his name. "David?" The sound was no longer just a whisper. It had become a chant, rhythmic and insistent, like a song he could not escape. He clutched his ears, trying to drown it out, but the voices were inside his head now, inside his very thoughts. He looked down at his hands, at the blood smeared across his palms, but when he glanced up again, everything had changed. The room, the dim light, the broken shards of the mirror, they were all gone. Instead, David found himself standing in the hallway of the house, but it was no longer the home of his childhood. It had become something else entirely, something dark and ancient. The walls were rotting, the wood warped and covered in thick layers of mildew. The ceiling sagged, the paint peeling and curling away like dead skin. The house was alive. David's feet moved on their own, the hallway stretching out before him, an endless tunnel of decay. His legs felt weak, but there was a compulsion in the pit of his stomach, a force pulling him forward, guiding him deeper into the house. The voices still called to him, but now there was another sound too. A scraping like claws dragging across the floor. A soft, rhythmic tapping like someone, or something, was walking toward him. David's pulse quickened, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He didn't want to look, didn't want to know what was coming, but he couldn't stop himself. The tapping grew louder, closer. Finally, from the shadows at the end of the hallway, a figure emerged. It was a man, but not a man. His body was hunched and twisted, his limbs too long, his skin stretched tight across his bones like a macabre puppet. His face was a nightmare, his features a grotesque mockery of human form, eyes too wide, mouth twisted into a grin that could not be natural. The man, if it could be called a man, moved toward David with unnerving speed, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, as though it were studying him. David stepped back, but his legs wouldn't obey him. He was frozen in place, trapped by the thing that approached him, its ragged breathing filling the air. "No," David whispered, his voice cracking. "No, not again." The thing stopped just inches from him. Its mouth opened wide, too wide, and out of it came a terrible, guttural sound, a low, throaty laugh that reverberated through the walls. It wasn't just laughing at him. It was laughing with him. The thing reached out with one long, spindly arm, its fingers curling like claws. It touched David's chest, its cold, clammy fingers sending a shock of ice through his body. "You don't belong here," it said, its voice a rasping whisper. "But neither do I." David tried to scream, but his throat was tight, his voice stolen by fear. He wanted to run, wanted to fight, but his body refused to move. The thing's fingers dug into his flesh, and he felt the pain, deep and hot, but he couldn't pull away. It was as though the very air had become a part of it, holding him in place, suffocating him. The creature leaned in close, its breath hot against David's ear. "You've been here before," it said, its voice low and insidious. "This house, this place, it's all a part of you now. You can't escape it." Not this time. David's mind screamed in protest, but the words rang true. He had been here before. The memories came flooding back, vivid and painful. The house wasn't just his childhood home, it was a prison, a place he had left long ago, but never truly escaped. The thing stepped back, its claws retracting from David's chest, leaving behind deep, raw gashes. And then it spoke again. It's coming for you. You can't run from the truth. David didn't understand what it meant at first, but then his eyes caught something in the darkness, something that hadn't been there before. A door, old and rotting, its wood cracked and splintered. The door was familiar. It was the door from the basement. David's heart pounded in his chest, and he turned, finally finding his legs, finally willing himself to move. He ran toward the door, desperate, his mind screaming at him to get away, but his feet carried him toward it anyway. His hand gripped the doorknob, cold and slick with sweat, and he twisted it, throwing the door open. The darkness beyond swallowed him whole. The basement was the same, but it wasn't. The smell of mildew and decay was stronger here, overwhelming his senses. The walls were damp, the floor slick with wetness, and in the corner there was something moving. The shape. It was the same shape as before, the thing that had worn his mother's face, the thing that had haunted him. But now it was different. It was waiting. David didn't want to face it, but he had no choice. He had to. As he stepped into the basement, the door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing like a thunderclap. The light flickered once more, casting long, grotesque shadows across the walls. The creature in the corner turned its head toward him, its eyes gleaming with malice. David took a step forward, his legs trembling beneath him. He felt it, felt the presence that was always there, always watching, always waiting. And then he heard it again. The voice. David? He spun around, but the darkness was too thick. He couldn't see anything anymore, nothing but the echoes of his own thoughts. He was alone. But was he? David could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on him, wrapping around his limbs like chains. His breath came in shallow gasps, each inhalation a battle against the oppressive air, thick with the stench of rot and despair. The basement had transformed into something worse, something far more terrifying than any place he had encountered in the house. The walls seemed to pulse, as though the house itself was breathing, alive with a hunger that stretched back centuries. The light above flickered again, its dim glow casting fleeting shadows that danced like the specters of the past. David could feel them, the ghosts of everything he had tried to forget, circling him, pulling at his very soul. The shape in the corner, the thing with his mother's face, shifted, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it were fighting to keep its form. The black eyes that stared at him held no empathy, no understanding, only a cold, malevolent presence that had lingered in this place for far too long. David took a slow step back, his body trembling with fear, but something deep inside him told him that running wasn't an option anymore. This wasn't just a house. It wasn't just a haunted place. It was his past, his memories, his mistakes, all twisted together into a nightmare that he couldn't escape. David? The voice came again, this time not from the thing in the corner, but from all around him, as though the very house itself was speaking his name. His skin crawled, the hairs on the back of his neck standing at attention. His eyes darted around the room, but the darkness had grown so thick that even his flashlight barely made a dent. He couldn't see the way out. He couldn't see anything except the creeping shadows that seemed to move toward him, shifting and swirling like smoke. The basement had become a labyrinth, one that twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, like the house was alive and feeding on his fear. Get out, he whispered to himself, his voice cracking. Get out now. But the door, the one he had entered through, was gone. The stairs that had once led up to the main floor were nothing more than a blur of blackness. He had no way to go but forward, deeper into the nightmare. The thing with his mother's face took a step forward, its grin widening until it seemed to consume the entire lower half of its face. Its body was still hunched, but now it seemed to grow taller, more imposing, its limbs elongating like twisted branches reaching out to ensnare him. It spoke again, its voice a hiss that scraped at David's sanity. Why did you leave me? David froze. The words, the question, cut through him like a knife. He knew they weren't meant for him. They were meant for the boy he had once been, the boy who had run from this place, from everything. But the weight of the question hit him with a force he couldn't explain, something deep inside him that had remained buried for years. You think you can escape it? The thing continued, its voice now a low growl. You can't. This place is in you, David. It's always been in you. David's chest tightened. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His mind was clouded with memories, with flashes of his childhood, of moments he had tried to bury. His mother. His father. the things they had kept from him. He closed his eyes, trying to block it all out, but it only intensified. The house was alive with their voices, their secrets, their pain. The thing in the corner, the one that was wearing his mother's face, lunged forward with a shriek, its arms reaching for him. David stumbled back, his mind still reeling, but the ground beneath him seemed to shift, the basement floor buckling as though it had become a living entity. He fell, his legs giving out beneath him, and the air exploded with a sound like the earth itself splitting open. When he hit the ground, everything went dark. He awoke in a place that wasn't the basement, but it wasn't anywhere he recognized either. The air was no longer thick with decay. Instead, it was heavy, charged, as if something electric had filled the space. The room was white, sterile, too clean for his comfort. David sat up, rubbing his head, his fingers slick with sweat. His heartbeat was erratic, his breath shallow. Where was he? The room was small, too small in fact. The walls were covered in strange, jagged symbols, and the floor was cold beneath him, like metal. He reached out, his hands brushing against the surface of the wall, and instantly, a shock of electricity ran through him, causing his muscles to tense. Where am I? The question came out as a breath, weak and desperate. His eyes darted around the room, but there was no answer. No sound, nothing but the hum of something unseen, something that felt far too close. His eyes settled on something in the corner, a shape, faintly glowing like an aura that stretched across the walls and ceiling. It was a symbol, though David couldn't tell what it meant. It seemed to throb like it was alive, like it had its own heartbeat. And then the voice came again. David? He whipped around, his breath catching in his throat. But there was no one there. The voice seemed to reverberate inside his skull, the sound rattling his bones. You can't escape, it whispered, and David felt its presence surrounding him, suffocating him. Not from her. Not from the house. David's heart pounded in his chest, his body shaking as the darkness returned, creeping from the edges of the room, swallowing the light. The whispers were louder now, 1,000 voices speaking at once, their words crashing together in a frenzy of noise. David reached out again, but the room was closing in on him. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, they were all moving, shifting like they were made of liquid, like the world around him was breaking apart. David, he couldn't take it anymore. His mind was unraveling, piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The voices were too strong. The house was too strong. And somewhere in the distance he could hear it, an echo, a faint sound like a door opening. Could it be? David stumbled forward, his body heavy, his mind in a haze. The walls continued to ripple around him, bending in unnatural ways, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear at the edges. The hum in the air had intensified, becoming a pulsing rhythm, like the heartbeat of something ancient and dark. His thoughts scrambled, racing in 1,000 directions, but there was one thing, one overwhelming pull that centered him. The door. The door that had appeared at the edge of his vision, faint and flickering like a mirage. He couldn't understand why it was so important, but he couldn't ignore it. Everything else, the shifting walls, the voices, had become secondary to the feeling that the door was his only way out, his only chance to escape whatever this place was. His feet dragged across the floor, each step a struggle as if the very ground was fighting him, but he couldn't stop. He had to get to that door. The closer he got, the more distorted the room seemed to become, the walls bending outward in grotesque angles. The symbols that had once glowed faintly now seethed with an angry intensity, their edges pulsing as though they were alive, demanding attention. David's breath hitched as he neared the door. It was the same, old, worn wood, cracked and splintered at the edges, but its presence was far more than just a doorway. It was an anchor in the madness, a symbol of something he had long forgotten, long buried. He reached out, trembling, his hand brushing against the cool surface of the door. The moment his fingers made contact, the world around him seemed to stop, the hum fading, the walls freezing in place. For the briefest of moments there was silence. And then the voice. David? This time it was no longer just a whisper. It was a roar, a scream that rattled his bones, that tore at his mind as if it were coming from deep within the house itself, from the very heart of it. He recoiled, his heart hammering in his chest, but his hand remained on the door. The door was the key. He knew it. With a desperate pull, he yanked the door open. The room beyond wasn't what he expected. It wasn't a hallway nor another room in the house. It was vast, empty, stretching out into an endless void. The floor beneath him was made of stone, cracked and weathered by time, the air cold and damp with the smell of earth. There was no ceiling, just an infinite expanse of shadow above him. And then he saw it. At the center of the room, hovering in the air as if suspended by some unseen force, was a figure. It was a woman, though not like any woman he had ever seen. Her form was a blur, shifting constantly as though she were made of smoke or shadows. Her face was obscured by a veil of darkness, but David could feel her eyes on him, watching, judging, waiting. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that David's breath came out in mist. His limbs froze, his muscles locking up as if the very cold had paralyzed him. He couldn't look away from the figure. "You came," the woman's voice said, her voice distant and hollow, like a whisper carried on the wind. "I knew you would." David's throat went dry. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice shaking. "What is this place?" The figure's form flickered, and then just as quickly solidified, its shape becoming clearer. It wasn't human, at least not in any way David could understand. Her skin, if it could be called that, was an ashen gray, her features twisted in an unnatural way, as though they had once been human but had been ravaged by something dark, something ancient. Her fingers were long, tapering to sharp points, and her hair, if it could be called hair, was a mass of writhing tendrils that slithered through the air like living serpents. "You know me," she said, her voice colder now, tinged with mockery. "I am the one you abandoned. The one you left behind." David felt a sharp pang in his chest. A name, a memory just beyond reach. It hovered at the edge of his mind, just out of his grasp. "The house," she continued, her voice now like a bitter laugh. "You can't run from it. It calls to you. It always has. It's in your blood, David. Just like me." David stumbled back, his hand pressing against the door frame to steady himself. "No," he gasped. "No, this isn't possible. Your mother," the figure interrupted, her form shifting, twisting like smoke. David's heart skipped a beat. The words echoed in his mind, reverberating through the room like a bell tolling. His mother? "No," David whispered, his knees giving out as the weight of the revelation crushed him. "No, that's not possible." But the woman, no, the thing, before him only smiled, a terrible, wide grin that split her face in two. "You ran," she said, her voice now a low, guttural rasp. "You left me behind. You left us all behind." David's mind reeled. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. The air was thick with the presence of something dark, something malevolent, and it was suffocating him. Suddenly the room shifted again. The floor buckled beneath him, and the figure began to dissolve, her body turning into a swirling mass of smoke and shadow. Her eyes, still fixed on David, gleamed with an unholy light. "You can't escape," she hissed, her voice now a shrill screech. "You'll never escape. You belong here. You always have." The room around him seemed to collapse, the walls closing in, the shadows reaching out to grab him. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, and the darkness swallowed him whole. David awoke with a gasp. His eyes snapped open, but everything was dark. He was lying on cold stone, his body aching, his breath ragged. Was it a dream? But the smell of decay, of mildew and rot, was still there, hanging in the air, and the faint sound of something, footsteps, echoed from somewhere in the distance. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady. This wasn't a dream. This was real. The house was still with him. It was never going to let him go. David's heart thundered in his chest as he stumbled through the darkness. The world around him was nothing but an oppressive blackness, the air thick and suffocating. He could feel the walls closing in on him, pressing in from all sides, and the ground beneath him was uneven, jagged. He didn't know how long he had been walking or where he was going, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't think. All he could do was move. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of footsteps echoed. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, the remnants of the nightmare still clinging to him. But then the footsteps grew louder, closer, and he knew. He wasn't alone. His breath caught in his throat, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. He turned, but there was nothing there. The hallway stretched out in front of him, an endless corridor of blackness that seemed to go on forever. But he could feel it, the presence. He could feel the eyes watching him, waiting. He wanted to scream, to shout, but no sound escaped his throat. His mouth was dry, his tongue thick in his mouth. His hands trembled as they scraped along the walls, searching for any sense of direction, any way out. The footsteps grew louder still, and then he heard something else. A voice. "David?" The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried with it a weight, a sorrow that seemed to echo through the very bones of the house. It was a voice he recognized, but he couldn't place it. "David, why are you running?" He froze. The voice was coming from behind him, and for the briefest moment he thought about turning around, confronting whatever it was that was calling his name. But he couldn't. He wasn't ready. Instead, he broke into a run. His legs screamed in protest as he bolted down the hall, each step heavy and uncertain. The walls seemed to twist and shift around him, the air growing colder with each passing moment. He rounded a corner and skidded to a halt, nearly falling. Ahead of him was a door, just a door no different from the others he had seen in this house. But there was something different about it. A pull, a sense of familiarity that David couldn't ignore. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling, but as soon as his fingers brushed against the cold metal, the door swung open on its own. He stepped inside. The room beyond was empty, or at least it seemed to be at first. It was a bedroom, a small one, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper, the floor covered in dust and old furniture. But there was something about the room that made David's skin crawl. Something in the air, thick and heavy, like it was soaked with memories, with regret. He stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the space. There was an old bed in the corner, its sheets tattered and stained. A rocking chair sat against the wall, unmoving, but David could have sworn it had been rocking just a moment before. In the center of the room was a small table, a single object resting upon it. David approached it, his feet dragging across the floor, and as he drew closer, he could see what it was. A photograph. David's breath caught in his throat as he reached out for it. The image was faded, the edges torn, but there was no mistaking the faces in the picture. His mother, his father, and standing between them, a small boy himself. But it wasn't just the photograph that made David's blood run cold. It was the expression on their faces. They were smiling, but it wasn't the kind of smile that a family would have in a picture. It was wrong, forced, twisted, like something was lurking beneath the surface. And then he noticed the shadows. They were faint at first, creeping along the edges of the photo, but as his eyes focused on them, they began to move. The shadows grew darker, more pronounced, until they seemed to reach out from the photograph, curling around the edges of the frame like long, skeletal fingers. David pulled his hand back in horror, but it was too late. The shadows began to spill out of the photo, creeping across the table and up the walls, stretching toward him. He backed away, his heart pounding, but there was nowhere to go. The room was closing in around him, the air thick with something cold and ancient. "David?" The voice came again, but this time it was not from the hallway, not from behind him. It was in the room right next to him. He spun around, and for the first time he saw her. The woman. The thing. The figure with his mother's face. She was standing in the doorway, her form still shifting, her features warped and twisted. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment he could see something. Something human, something familiar, before it was swallowed by the darkness that consumed her. "Why did you leave me?" she asked, her voice a haunting echo of the past. David tried to speak, but no words came. His throat was dry, his mouth a desert. His hands shook uncontrollably, and his legs threatened to buckle beneath him. "You think you can escape?" she continued, her voice growing louder, sharper. "You can't. You can never escape what you are. What we are." David wanted to scream, wanted to run, but his body refused to move. He was frozen in place, his mind racing, but his body unwilling to cooperate. The shadows continued to creep across the room, crawling toward him, their tendrils wrapping around his legs, pulling him down. He tried to fight, to break free, but the more he struggled, the tighter the shadows gripped him. And then the floor beneath him gave way. He fell, his body plunging into the darkness. David's body slammed against cold stone. The air rushed from his lungs as he hit the ground with a sickening thud. For a moment, everything was black, silent. The world seemed to have swallowed him whole, and for a heartbeat, he wondered if this was it. This was where it all ended. But then his senses began to return one by one. The bitter cold of the stone beneath him, the faint smell of earth and decay in the air. And the darkness. The impenetrable darkness that seemed to have no end. He struggled to his feet, his legs shaky, his head pounding. He reached out, hands brushing against the rough walls, trying to orient himself. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind spinning as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. He had fallen into the unknown, into whatever this place was. But the memories of the room, the photograph, the figure of his mother, it all rushed back, crashing over him in a wave of terror. The shadows, the voice. He could still hear her words echoing in his head. "You can never escape what you are." He stumbled forward, his feet dragging, the stone floor cold beneath him. His eyes strained against the darkness, but he could see nothing. There was only the thick, oppressive blackness pressing in on him, suffocating him. David's heart thudded in his chest as he moved, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He wasn't alone. He knew that now. Something else was down here with him. something that had been waiting for him. David? The voice again. It was no longer the soft, haunting whisper. It was louder, sharper, closer. The sound of his name reverberated off the walls, like a call from the depths of the earth itself. His blood ran cold. He froze, his heart racing. He turned in every direction, but there was nothing. The voice had come from nowhere, from everywhere. He couldn't escape it. Why did you leave me? This time the voice wasn't a whisper. It was clear, anguished, full of pain. David's stomach twisted. He knew that voice. He had heard it his whole life. It was the voice of his mother. But it wasn't the woman he remembered. It wasn't the woman who had cared for him, who had raised him. This was something else. Something worse. Stop it, he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. His hands were shaking, his body trembling from the cold and fear. But he couldn't stop moving. Couldn't stop searching. He had to find a way out. There had to be a way out. The darkness seemed to close in tighter with every step he took, the walls shifting in his periphery, making him feel as though he were being swallowed whole. The air was thick and heavy, pressing down on him, as if the very space he occupied was a part of something much larger, something that stretched far beyond the limits of this room, this house, this cursed place. He turned another corner and stopped dead in his tracks. Ahead of him, barely visible in the gloom, was a figure. David's pulse spiked. His mouth went dry. It was the same figure, the woman with his mother's face. Her form was still shifting, her features flickering in and out of view like a reflection on water disturbed by an unseen hand. No, David gasped. No, not you, not again. The woman tilted her head slightly, her movements slow, deliberate. The shadows around her seemed to swirl, gathering like storm clouds. You think you can escape me? She asked, her voice now a low, guttural growl. You think you can leave this place and forget? David took a step back, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. The fear that gripped him was so cold, so sharp, that it paralyzed him. The woman reached out, her long, bony fingers stretching toward him. You can't escape what you are, she repeated, her voice echoing in the void. David felt a chill run through him as her touch brushed against his cheek. It was cold, unnaturally so, and he could feel it, feel the years of regret, of pain, of something ancient and wrong coursing through her. No, he whispered. No, I'm not like you. I'm not like this. Her smile was twisted, cruel. You are me, David. You always have been. The ground beneath him seemed to shake, the walls warping as if the very room itself was alive, shifting, moving around him. The air thickened, making it hard to breathe. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. The house was alive, aware of him, of what he was. Let go, she hissed. Let go and join us. Join me. David couldn't breathe. The words were suffocating him, drowning him in their meaning. He could feel himself slipping, his grip on reality loosening. He could feel his mind, his very sense of self, beginning to fracture under the weight of it all. He knew what she wanted. He knew what she was asking. She wanted him to surrender, to embrace the darkness, to become one with it, with her. But David wasn't going to give in. Not this time. With every ounce of strength he had left, he pushed back. He pulled himself away from her, staggering backward, his feet stumbling over the uneven ground. And oh, he shouted, his voice hoarse. I won't let you win. I won't let you take me. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the small, forgotten object he had tucked away earlier, the photograph. The photograph of his family, his mother. He didn't know why he had it, but he knew what it was, what it represented. It was his past, his life. It was the one thing that hadn't been consumed by the darkness. And oh, he shouted again, holding the photo before him. The woman's form flickered violently, her features twisting and contorting as though the very act of holding the photo was burning her. She screamed, a terrible sound, like the wailing of 1,000 souls in agony. The shadows began to writhe around her, recoiling from the photograph as if it were poison. The ground shook violently, the very walls of the house screaming in protest. David's grip on the photograph tightened, and in that moment he felt it. The house was screaming, the entity inside it, the thing that had once been his mother, was screaming, writhing, burning from the light. The world cracked open. With a final, ear-splitting roar, the darkness shattered. The walls around him disintegrated into nothingness, and David was plunged into a blinding light. David awoke in the stillness of his bed, gasping for air. His heart raced, his body drenched in sweat. The room was silent, the world outside untouched by the horrors he had experienced. It was over. But as he sat up, gasping for breath, he noticed something. The photograph. It was lying on the nightstand next to him. And in it, his mother smiled back at him, her eyes hollow, empty. And in the background, the faintest shadow watching, waiting. The fog clung to the landscape like a thick, suffocating veil. It crept through the trees, curling around the ancient stone walls of the house, and over the cracked driveway where the headlights of a lone car barely cut through the dense mist. The road had been narrow, winding through desolate stretches of forest, and as it twisted past the edge of a dilapidated town, it seemed to lead to nowhere. Ben Harding gripped the wheel tighter, squinting through the windshield, his heart racing as the shadows of the surrounding trees began to close in on him. He should have turned back, he knew that now. But the road was one of those rare, winding paths that had drawn him in from the moment he'd seen it. There was something about the isolation, the quiet pull of the unknown, that had felt like destiny. His car rolled to a stop in front of the house, its imposing silhouette cutting through the fog like some ancient predator watching him from the dark. It was a large place, built of weathered stone and aged wood, with jagged turrets and sprawling wings that seemed to stretch outward like the fingers of a giant hand. The kind of house you'd expect to see in a forgotten part of a horror movie, its shutters hanging crookedly, its front porch swaying dangerously as though it had been abandoned for years. He had rented the place for a weekend, needing a break from the frantic pace of his city life. The brochure had promised peace and quiet, an escape from the noise, the stress. Ben had hoped for a chance to clear his head, something he hadn't done in far too long. But something in the air felt wrong, off-kilter, like the house itself was watching him. The door creaked open as he stepped out, and the distant howl of the wind seemed to echo through the trees, calling to him in a way that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He took a deep breath, steeling himself against the chill, and made his way toward the entrance. He wasn't sure why, but he had an undeniable urge to get inside, to escape the fog and the heavy silence that pressed in around him. The door swung open with a groan as Ben stepped across the threshold. His eyes immediately took in the space, dark wood paneling, aged furniture, and the unmistakable scent of dust and decay. It was everything he had expected, and yet it felt wrong. The stillness was oppressive, and as he glanced around the empty, dimly lit hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. A flicker of motion caught his eye. Just beyond the corner, the faintest shadow, barely visible, flitting across the hallway. He froze for a moment, his breath caught in his throat. But when he turned, there was nothing there. Nothing but the oppressive silence. Ben swallowed hard, trying to shake the unease gnawing at the edges of his mind. He wasn't a superstitious man, nor was he prone to jumping at shadows. But there was something about this place, this house, that set him on edge in a way he couldn't explain. A noise, soft and distant, echoed from somewhere deep within the house. Footsteps, perhaps. Slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking just out of view. His hand instinctively reached for his phone, but the moment he tried to unlock it, the screen went black. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he glanced down, his finger tapping the power button, but nothing happened. The battery indicator showed full when he had arrived. Now it was dead. Great, Ben muttered to himself, glancing back down the hallway. There was a staircase to his right, spiraling upward into the shadows. To his left, the hallway stretched into what appeared to be a parlor of some kind, the faintest light coming from a single lamp on an end table. The hairs on his neck prickled as another sound, this time closer, echoed from the upper floor. A dragging, scraping sound like furniture being shifted or something heavy being dragged across the floor. Ben hesitated. The rational part of him told him to leave, to get back in the car and drive as fast as he could. But his curiosity, his desire for a peaceful weekend, rooted him to the spot. With a quiet sigh, he stepped into the hallway, his boots muffled by the thick carpeting. His pulse quickened, each step heavier than the last. The sound was now unmistakable, slow, deliberate dragging, as though someone, or something, was making its way across the floor above. He reached the bottom of the stairs, pausing to listen. The house seemed to exhale, a groaning sound from deep within its foundation, as if it was alive, breathing in the cold night air. Then, just as he was about to turn back, a door at the end of the hall creaked open, the sound piercing through the stillness. Ben froze, his eyes locking on the shadowy figure that emerged from the room beyond. A woman, tall and gaunt, stood there. Her face was pale, her dark eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a jolt of fear through his chest. She didn't move, just stood there, watching him in a way that was both unnerving and curious. "Can I help you?" Ben's voice was rough, cracking from disuse. The woman didn't respond at first. She simply stared, her expression unreadable, as if she were trying to decipher his very soul. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she disappeared into the darkness, the door swinging closed behind her with a soft thud. Ben's heart hammered in his chest as he took a step back. He didn't know what had just happened, but a part of him felt he wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't alone, not in this house, not in this forsaken place. And whatever that was, whatever he had just seen, was only the beginning. He turned back toward the door, his mind racing, his pulse pounding in his ears. But just before he could take another step, a loud crash echoed from above. The unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Ben's breath caught in his throat. The house had just become a prison. Ben stood frozen in place, staring at the door the woman had just vanished behind. The crashing sound from above, something heavy, something large, had shaken him to the core. His body tensed, muscles stiffened, and for the first time in years he felt utterly vulnerable. Something was wrong here. Something was very wrong. The silence followed, thick and suffocating, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting. He could feel the weight of the air pressing down on him, the heaviness of the atmosphere hanging in every corner, every shadow. He had to move. He had to find out what that sound was, where it had come from. His feet felt like lead as he turned toward the staircase, the steps creaking ominously under his weight. Every part of him screamed to turn back, to leave, but that inexplicable pull, the same one that had driven him to rent this place in the first place, held him there. The house seemed to exhale again, a low groaning sound coming from deep within the floorboards. His breath caught in his throat as he took the first step. The moment his foot landed, the entire staircase shifted under his weight, as if the wood had been twisted and warped by years of neglect. It groaned and squealed like the dying breath of a trapped animal. He hesitated, then took another step. The second floor seemed so distant, a faraway realm shrouded in darkened hallways and closed doors. The weight of the house pressed down from above, as if the walls themselves were leaning in on him. And yet, the sound of dragging, soft, deliberate, agonizingly slow, pulled him forward. He had to know. He had to understand. Another step. He could almost hear the whispers in the walls now. The soft murmur of 1,000 voices long silenced. For a moment he thought he heard his name. A faint voice calling from the top of the stairs. But he flinched, his heart pounding louder than his footsteps. But when he looked up, there was nothing. Just the long, winding hallway stretching ahead into darkness. The second floor was more unnerving than the first. A long, narrow hallway with closed doors on either side. There were no windows here, no natural light, only the oppressive dimness of the electric bulbs overhead, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally along the walls. The dragging sound continued, unrelenting, each scrape of whatever it was seeming to grow closer with each passing second. Ben swallowed hard and forced himself to keep moving. He could feel the pulse in his neck, the sweat dripping from his palms as he grasped the rail and moved forward. As he passed the first door on his right, he noticed something strange. A symbol had been etched into the door. It wasn't deep, more like a faded carving, as if someone had scratched it with a dull knife. It was an intricate pattern of lines and curves, an odd, almost abstract shape that seemed to distort as his eyes tried to focus on it. Ben felt an irrational shiver crawl down his spine. He didn't know why, but he knew in that instant that it wasn't just a random mark. It was something more, something old. He stepped away, his pulse quickening, and continued down the hall toward the source of the dragging. But with every step, the air grew colder, heavier, like he was sinking deeper into something that wasn't quite real. The shadows seemed to shift and pulse around him, and every so often, he caught a glimpse of movement, a flicker just out of the corner of his eye. Then he reached the end of the hall. The last door. It was slightly ajar, just enough to reveal a sliver of the darkness beyond. The sound of dragging was deafening now, as if whatever it was right behind the door, waiting. Ben took a breath, his mind screaming at him to turn back. But something primal and inexplicable, pushed him forward. He reached out and slowly, cautiously pushed the door open. The room was dark. So dark that the dim bulb above seemed to barely penetrate the gloom. But it wasn't the darkness that froze Ben in place. It was what he saw within it. A figure, hunched and moving slowly across the floor. The dragging noise was coming from this person, or was it? The figure didn't appear to be alive, yet it moved with a strange, unnatural slowness, its limbs twisting at odd angles. It was a woman. She was tall, gaunt, her skin pale and stretched tight over bones that seemed too large for her frame. Her hair, long and black, hung in thick strands around her face, obscuring her eyes, but Ben could see her mouth. It was a wide, gaping thing, stretched too far, too wide, as if it had been carved that way. The dragging noise came from her arms, or perhaps the broken, splintered remnants of them. She moved as if the limbs weren't her own, as if they were detached, no longer part of her. The sound of her dragging those limbs across the floor was sickening, a scraping, squelching noise that churned Ben's stomach. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His feet, rooted to the spot, wouldn't obey. His body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. And then, just as he thought his heart might burst from his chest, the woman stopped moving. She turned slowly toward him. Her face, a mass of twisted flesh and dark, hollow eyes, fixed on him. There was no expression, no emotion. Just the emptiness of a thing that had long since ceased to be human. And then, in a voice that sounded like gravel being ground underfoot, she spoke. Leave. The word was a command, a warning. Ben's blood ran cold, and the air around him seemed to freeze. His breath caught in his throat, and he tried to move, to run, but his legs were like stone. The woman raised her arms, the broken limbs hanging like twisted roots from a dying tree. Her eyes, their blackness consuming every shred of light, never left his face. And just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone, vanishing into the darkness with the same slow, deliberate pace as before. Her dragging noise faded into the walls, swallowed by the house as if it had never been there. Ben stood in the doorway, unable to move, unable to breathe. The silence in the room was deafening now, and the weight of what he had just seen pressed on him like a physical thing. His mind screamed in terror, but his body refused to react. He had to get out. Turning quickly, he bolted from the room, back down the hall, past the strange symbol on the door, and down the stairs. The house seemed to groan louder now, the floors creaking underfoot, the air thick with something unspoken. As Ben reached the front door, he stopped, his hand hovering over the knob. Something told him to look back. Just one last time. And when he did, the hallway was empty. The shadows were still. But the feeling lingered. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. Ben didn't sleep that night. Even though the hours passed in a haze of confusion and dread, sleep never found him. He lay wide-eyed, staring at the dark ceiling, the muffled sounds of the house settling around him. Every creak, every groan of the floorboards was a reminder that something was wrong, something deeply wrong. The fog had thickened overnight, pressing against the windows like a living thing, casting the room in an eerie, unrelenting gloom. The air felt heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. And Ben? He was waiting too. Waiting for the next thing to happen. For whatever haunted this place to reveal itself fully, to show him exactly what it wanted. The events of the previous night played over and over in his mind, each detail like a splinter that burrowed deeper into his thoughts. The woman, her twisted limbs, the dragging, scraping sound. Her eyes, the way they bore into him, empty yet full of something he couldn't name. She wasn't human, not anymore. And that was the most terrifying part. He had to know more. There was no escaping the pull of the house, the relentless tug that seemed to guide his every movement, like an invisible hand leading him back into the abyss. As the day stretched on, Ben found himself wandering the house again. The sun had barely begun to rise, but the house, with its thick walls and deep shadows, remained cold and oppressive. He couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on him, that something, or someone, was watching his every move. He passed the room where he had seen the woman, his heart pounding as he approached the door. It was closed now, the eerie symbol still visible on the wood, but nothing else seemed out of place. No dragging sounds, no figure in the corner of the room. He reached out slowly, his hand trembling as he grasped the doorknob. It felt cold to the touch, the metal slick with condensation from the thick fog outside. He hesitated, his mind screaming at him to turn away, to leave the house for good. But he couldn't. Not yet. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The room was exactly as it had been before. Dark, silent, and empty. For a moment, he thought it was all in his head. Maybe the fear had gotten to him last night, distorting his mind. Maybe he had imagined it all. The woman, the dragging sound, the feeling of eyes on him. But as his gaze swept across the room, his eyes fell on something new. On the floor, near the far wall, was a small, folded piece of paper. It wasn't there before. Ben was sure of it. His pulse quickened as he stepped forward, his footfalls muffled by the thick carpet. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and there was something about it, something in the way it was positioned, that made his skin crawl. He crouched down, hesitating for a moment before he reached out and picked it up. It was a single sheet, folded neatly in half. Ben carefully unfolded it, his eyes scanning the jagged handwriting that filled the page. The words were written in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl, as if the writer had been in a rush to get them down before time ran out. Asterisk, he is always here. Waiting. Watching. Don't trust the walls. Don't trust the house. We'll take you too. Just like it took me. It's hungry. Always hungry. You can't stop it. You can't stop it. It's coming for you. It's coming for all of us. Asterisk. The words sent a chill down his spine, his fingers trembling as he held the paper. Who had written this? And why? The final sentence, the one about it coming for all of them, lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. It was almost like a warning, a plea for someone to listen, to escape before it was too late. Ben looked around the room again, the sense of being watched growing stronger, more intense. The walls seemed to whisper, their ancient timbers groaning under the weight of something unseen. He could feel the air shifting, thickening, as if the house itself were alive, breathing around him. He folded the paper carefully, slipping it into his pocket, and stood up. The dragging sound from last night seemed to echo in his ears once again, distant but growing louder with each passing moment. Something was moving upstairs. Ben's heart pounded as he turned toward the stairs, a sense of dread settling over him like a heavy cloak. The dragging noise was unmistakable now, its rhythm slow and deliberate, as if whatever it was had all the time in the world. With a deep breath, he began to climb the stairs. His feet seemed to grow heavier with each step, as if the house itself were trying to hold him back. The wood creaked beneath him, the sound vibrating up his legs, making his bones ache. He reached the top, the hallway stretching before him, dark and silent. The door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar again, the same door he had seen the woman disappear into last night. The dragging sound was louder now, closer. Ben moved toward the door, his breath shallow, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. As he reached for the doorknob, he could feel the temperature drop, the air growing thick and cold around him. The door was heavier than it should have been, as if something on the other side was pushing against it, refusing to let him in. Finally, he forced it open. The room was dark, almost pitch black, but he could make out the shape of something, or someone, moving slowly across the floor. The dragging sound was deafening now, the only noise in the house, filling the room with an oppressive presence. Ben stepped into the room, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, but it took him a moment to realize what he was seeing. It wasn't the woman. Not anymore. It was a man. Or at least it had been. His body was twisted, contorted in unnatural ways, his limbs stretched far beyond their breaking point. His eyes, wide and staring, locked onto Ben's with an intensity that sent a wave of nausea through him. The man, or what was left of him, dragged himself across the floor, his movements jerky and broken, his mouth gaping open as if trying to scream, but no sound came out. The smell of decay, of rot, filled the room, making Ben's stomach turn. And then, with a sudden violent lurch, the figure stopped moving. Ben stood frozen in place, his heart racing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure's eyes never left him. They were full of horror, full of something darker, something Ben couldn't understand. And then, in a voice so faint, so filled with terror that it barely registered, the man whispered, "Asterisk, it's already here, asterisk." The room went deathly silent. And then the floor beneath Ben's feet gave way. Ben's stomach lurched as the floor beneath him cracked. One moment he was standing solidly in the doorway, the next his feet were no longer on anything solid. The floor splintered and collapsed, a horrible, splintering crack that seemed to come from deep within the very bones of the house. He had no time to scream. His body plummeted into darkness, falling through the rotting wood like a rag doll, until everything spun and blurred in an unholy rush. The sensation of falling was endless, and the air, thick and foul with the smell of mildew and decay, ripped at his lungs. Then, with a sickening thud, Ben hit the ground. His body slammed against something cold and unforgiving. His head exploded with pain as the world tilted and spun. Dazed and disoriented, he lay there for what felt like an eternity, the hum of blood rushing in his ears drowning out the strange sounds that surrounded him. When his vision finally cleared, Ben found himself in what seemed like a dark, forgotten cellar, the stench of old stone and damp earth clinging to the air. His limbs ached, his body bruised and scraped from the fall, but somehow nothing seemed broken. His heart was still pounding, erratic and wild, as the terror from the fall began to creep back in. It took him a few moments to gather his bearings. The faint light from above, flickering and distant, told him the opening was far, far above him, and the drop had been deeper than he had anticipated. But the worst part wasn't the fall itself. It was what he saw in the darkness. The shadows at the far end of the room seemed to shift and move, impossibly fluid, as though something, or someone, was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. The darkness clung to the edges of his vision, always just out of reach, like a predatory thing that waited to strike. He felt it all around him now, the air thickening with every breath. Ben forced himself to his feet, though his legs shook with each step, as if the fall had drained every ounce of strength from his body. He could feel the chill in the air, a cold that wasn't just temperature. It was something deeper, a cold that seeped into his very bones. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, littered with debris, old crates, broken furniture, and strange, weathered objects that seemed to have been abandoned here for decades. His hands trembled as he brushed the dust from an old chest, half hidden beneath the rubble, but nothing seemed to offer any answers. The sense of being watched was almost suffocating now. He could hear the faintest noises, scraping, shifting, the echo of something moving just out of sight, but nothing was there. Nothing solid, at least. Then came the whispers. Low at first, like the murmur of wind, then louder, more distinct. The walls around him seemed to breathe, their ancient stones shifting as though they were alive, exhaling their own damp breath. The whispers filled the room, and with them came the knowledge. He was not alone. Ben stood still, his pulse racing as the whispers grew louder. They spoke in a language he didn't understand, though their tone was unmistakably hostile, a sound that filled him with dread. They clawed at his sanity, scratching at the edges of his mind, driving him closer to madness with every word. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come, asterisk, one of them hissed. The voice was sharp, cruel, and ancient. Asterisk, you should have stayed away. Asterisk. Ben's heart jumped. The whisper had come from just behind him, so close he could almost feel the breath on his neck. He spun around but saw nothing. Only darkness and the oppressive weight of the cellar closing in around him. His breath was shallow, each inhale a struggle as the air seemed to thicken with every passing second. Panic began to rise in his chest, but then something else caught his attention, something that froze him in place. It was the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, dragging across the floor just like the woman's from last night. It was coming from the far side of the room, from the deepest shadows, where the light couldn't reach. Ben wanted to run, to find the nearest exit and never look back. But his body refused to cooperate, paralyzed by a fear so intense, it felt like he was drowning. The footsteps grew louder, and with them came the growing sense of something watching him, something close, so close. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure, pale, twisted, and moving with a dreadful slowness, emerged from the darkness. The dragging sound intensified as the figure approached, each movement more jerky, more unnatural than the last. The figure was a woman, or what had once been a woman, but her form was distorted, as if her very being had been corrupted by the house itself. Her limbs were long and stretched, twisted at odd angles, as though they had been broken and reformed in ways that were never meant to be. Her hair was a tangled mass of dark strands, wild and unkempt, falling over a face that was almost entirely hidden, except for her eyes, those black, soulless eyes that seemed to swallow all light. Ben's blood ran cold. The dragging sound of her movements became a steady rhythm now, like a countdown. She was coming closer. And with each step, the darkness around them thickened, the shadows in the room deepening until it felt like they were closing in, compressing the space, suffocating him. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His legs were frozen to the floor, his body too terrified to move. His mind screamed at him to do something, anything, but his body betrayed him, locked in place, unable to escape the woman who was now only a few feet away. She stopped in front of him, and for a long, unbearable moment, nothing happened. The room was thick with silence, with the crushing weight of her presence. And then, in the same gravelly voice that had haunted him the night before, she spoke again. Asterisk, you're not supposed to be here. You don't belong here, asterisk. Ben tried to back away, but his legs felt like lead. His heart thundered in his chest, each beat like a hammer, each breath a struggle. The woman reached out a hand, its fingers twisted and broken, the skin pale and mottled like decaying flesh. She touched his face, her fingers cold as ice, sending a shock of terror straight through him. Asterisk, we all belong here, in asterisk, she whispered, her voice low, almost intimate. Asterisk, this place, it's our home now. And you will be part of it, too, asterisk. Ben's world spun, his vision going black around the edges as the room seemed to tilt. The whispers grew louder, louder, and the dragging sound filled his ears, until it was all he could hear. His thoughts fractured, broken under the weight of the horror he was facing. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the pressure lifted. The woman vanished, her figure melting back into the darkness as if she had never been there at all. The coldness remained, though, and the whispers, their words, hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Ben stumbled backward, his legs finally giving way beneath him. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, his mind reeling, his body shaking with fear and exhaustion. But the worst part was the feeling that had returned to him. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. In the house, it was awake. The silence that followed Ben's collapse was deafening. He lay there on the cold stone floor of the cellar, his chest rising and falling in rapid gasps, trying to calm his racing heart. His mind was a storm of confusion and terror, each thought jumbled and incoherent. He could still feel the coldness of the woman's touch lingering on his skin, a chill that seemed to seep deeper into his very soul. Her words echoed in his ears, each syllable heavy with a meaning he couldn't yet understand. Asterisk, we all belong here. Asterisk. The words rattled through his mind, repeating over and over. The house, it had been watching him, waiting for him. And now it was alive. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The house itself was no longer just an inanimate structure. It was a presence, a force, and it wanted him. Ben's breath quickened as he slowly pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. The room around him was still shrouded in darkness, the faintest flicker of light coming from a cracked window high above. The shadows seemed to move, their shapes shifting and contorting in ways that made his skin crawl. The floor beneath his feet groaned as if the house were sighing, settling into its new victim. Every movement in the room, every slight shift of air, felt amplified. His senses were on high alert, straining to catch any sign of danger. He could feel the walls pressing in on him, the very structure of the house seemingly pulsing with a dark energy, as if the building itself were breathing, living. He had to get out. He had to leave. But where could he go? He had no idea how to escape this nightmare. Every door he opened seemed to lead him deeper into the bowels of this place, deeper into whatever madness it harbored. Ben stumbled toward the far wall, his hand brushing against the cold stone. He needed something, anything, to guide him. A way out. A clue. His fingers brushed over an old rusted metal pipe that ran along the wall. It was warm to the touch, almost unnaturally so, like it had been heated by something beneath the surface. The sudden heat made him pause, his thoughts momentarily distracted. Then he heard it again. The dragging sound. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more distinct, as though something, or someone, was getting closer. The rhythmic scrape of heavy feet dragging across the floor, slow and deliberate, moving in his direction. Ben spun around, his heart racing in his chest. His eyes darted across the cellar, searching for the source of the noise, but there was nothing there. Only darkness. And yet, the sound continued to grow, closer now, unmistakably close. And then he saw it. A shadow. Moving across the far corner of the room, slinking along the floor like some kind of monstrous animal. It was low to the ground, its form distorted, as if it were trying to hide in plain sight. The shape was too fluid, too unnatural to be anything human. Ben's breath caught in his throat as the shadow slowly coalesced into a figure he knew all too well. It was her. The woman. But this time she wasn't walking on her twisted legs. No, she was crawling, dragging herself along the floor like some grotesque insect. Her limbs twisted unnaturally, her body jerking and spasming with each movement, as though the very act of moving caused her pain. Her hair, wild and matted, hung in front of her face, obscuring her features. But even in the dim light, Ben could see the faint glimmer of her eyes, those dark, hollow eyes. They locked onto him immediately, fixing him with a stare that made his blood run cold. She let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that was more animal than human, and began to move toward him, her body jerking forward in short, spasmodic bursts. Ben took a step back, his mind screaming for him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The fear had him frozen in place, paralyzed by the nightmare unfolding before him. The woman's mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, her jaw unhinging as if it were made of rubber. A guttural, rasping sound came from her throat as she let out a wordless cry, her body now fully contorting as she dragged herself closer. "Help me." The words were faint, barely audible over the cacophony of noise in his mind, but they were enough to make Ben freeze. He felt a sudden rush of nausea, as if the very air around him had thickened, becoming suffocating. For the first time since he had arrived, he felt the weight of the house's history pressed down on him, 1,000 tragedies layered on top of one another, feeding the malevolent force that now hunted him. The house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed, and he was part of that curse now. The walls, the floors, the very air, they were alive with it. The woman's figure grew closer, her crawling body making horrible, scraping sounds as her twisted limbs dragged across the stone floor. Her hands, skeletal and claw-like, reached out toward him, her nails scraping the ground with a sound that made his skin crawl. Then, as if on cue, the house itself seemed to respond. The walls groaned and a deep, resonant rumble vibrated through the floor beneath Ben's feet. The sound of something shifting, something large and old, echoed in the distance. It was as though the house itself were coming alive, reacting to the presence of this creature. "Get out, now." The whisper came again. This time it was louder, more insistent. It wasn't the woman's voice. No, this was something deeper, more ancient, coming from within the very walls. Ben's head snapped toward the source of the voice, but the shadows only seemed to grow thicker. The air was alive with whispers now, a low murmur that filled the space, scratching at the edges of his sanity. The woman reached out with one skeletal hand and Ben's blood turned to ice. He had no choice. There was no running, no escape. The house had him. With a scream that tore from his throat, Ben bolted toward the far wall, his heart pounding in his ears. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to move, had to get away from the crawling thing that was almost upon him. His hand grasped a loose stone, and with all his strength, he yanked it free. The stone came loose with a wet crack, and a rush of stale air flooded the room, the scent of rot and decay filling his nostrils. Then he saw it. A passageway. A narrow, forgotten tunnel that led deep beneath the house, hidden away from the light of day. Without a second thought, Ben dropped the stone and scrambled toward it. The woman was almost on him now, her skeletal hand brushing against his leg as he dove into the passageway. The walls closed in on him as he crawled deeper into the darkness, the sound of her dragging body following him, growing fainter as he moved further away. But the whispers in his ears, those whispers, continued to follow him. Ben's breath came in ragged gasps as he crawled through the narrow tunnel, the damp earth scraping at his palms. The space was tight, claustrophobic, and the deeper he went, the more the oppressive weight of the house seemed to close in on him. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but he didn't dare. The woman, whatever she was still close behind, dragging herself through the passage with a slow, relentless hunger. He could almost feel her claws scratching against the walls, could almost hear her breath, wet and labored, in the air around him. The tunnel twisted and turned, each corner leading him deeper into the heart of the house. It smelled like the earth here, damp and rotten, and the walls seemed to pulse as if the very stone itself was alive. Ben had no idea where this passageway led, but it felt wrong. Everything about this place felt wrong. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing off the walls, surrounding him like a storm. They were unintelligible, but Ben could feel them clawing at his mind, tugging at his sanity, pulling him toward the brink of madness. The voices were everywhere, seeping from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. And they weren't just whispers anymore. They were cries, tortured, desperate cries. He couldn't focus on any single one of them. They were all blending together, a cacophony of sound that filled his skull, making his head throb with pain. He couldn't think. He couldn't think of anything except the gnawing terror that gripped his chest, the overwhelming fear that whatever he had stumbled into was far beyond anything he could comprehend. "Get out, get out, get out," the words repeated in his mind like a drumbeat, each repetition louder, more insistent. Ben's pulse quickened. His eyes darted ahead, searching the dimness for any sign of light, but there was nothing. Just more darkness, stretching out endlessly before him. The walls were closing in, and the tunnel seemed to grow smaller, tighter, until he couldn't even draw a full breath. "Help me," a voice called to him from the shadows. He froze, his body rigid with fear. The voice was familiar, soft, almost pleading, a sound he recognized from the first night. It was the woman's voice. "I was lost, just like you. I didn't know. They don't tell you. They never tell you what happens." Ben's mind raced. He couldn't tell if she was speaking to him or if it was just the echo of his own thoughts. His own guilt, his own terror manifesting in the form of her voice. But there was something in it, something in the way she said those words, that made him stop dead in his tracks. "They don't tell you what happens." The passageway suddenly felt colder, a biting chill that cut through his clothes like a knife. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, but it didn't help. The cold was seeping deeper, burrowing into his bones. There was a sudden, sharp sound, something metallic scraping against stone, and Ben jerked his head toward it, heart hammering in his chest. The woman's figure, twisted, broken, and crawling, was emerging from the shadows. Her body contorted as she dragged herself toward him, moving with an unnatural, jerking rhythm. The tunnel was too small for her to stand, but she didn't need to stand. The way she moved, like an animal, like something long forgotten, made his blood run cold. Asterisk help me asterisk, she whispered again, her voice hoarse and distorted, as if she had been whispering for centuries. Asterisk help me, before it's too late, asterisk. Ben stumbled backward, his hands scraping against the walls for purchase. The woman's eyes locked onto his, those dark hollow eyes that seemed to swallow all light. He wanted to scream, but his throat was dry, the words stuck in his chest. He could feel the darkness of the house pressing in on him from all sides, closing in, suffocating him. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, the woman froze. Her body shuddered violently, a spasm that rattled through her twisted limbs. The air around her seemed to vibrate, a low, eerie hum that shook the walls of the tunnel. Ben didn't know what was happening, but he felt it. Something in the air had changed. The temperature plummeted, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. A frantic chorus that surrounded him, drowning him in noise. Leave now, before it takes you. The voice wasn't the woman's anymore. It was something else, something older, deeper. It felt like the house itself, the very stone beneath his feet, was speaking to him. Ben turned and ran. He didn't care where he was going anymore. He didn't care about the way the tunnel twisted and turned, or the way the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. All he knew was that the thing behind him was closing in, and the air was thick with the promise of something terrible. The walls of the tunnel were getting tighter, the passageway shrinking with each step. He could feel the pressure against his chest, like the house was trying to squeeze the life out of him. The air was thick and choking, and the whispers were deafening, drowning out all other sound. His hands scrabbled against the walls, trying to find purchase, trying to push forward, but the walls seemed to move, to shift beneath his fingers. It felt like he was running in place, like the tunnel was stretching out endlessly, pulling him deeper into its maw. You can't escape, the voice echoed from all around him, a whisper that felt like a physical blow. You're part of it now, part of the house? Ben's chest tightened. He couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in around him, pressing against his ribs, squeezing the air from his lungs. He had to keep going. He had to escape. But then there was a sound, an awful wet sound, that made him freeze. It was behind him. It wasn't the woman's crawling footsteps anymore. It was something worse. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. And then he felt it. Cold fingers, claws jagged and sharp, gripped the back of his neck. Ben didn't have time to scream. The world around him spun as he was yanked backward, pulled into the darkness. The last thing he saw before everything went black were the woman's eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, staring at him, unblinking, as if they were waiting for him to join her in the darkness. The whispers swirled around him, and he was gone. The darkness was absolute. No light, no sound, no breath of wind. Ben's mind swirled in the void, his thoughts too heavy to keep afloat in the suffocating silence. He could feel the weight of it pressing against his chest, like 1,000 unseen hands were holding him down, pinning him to the ground. He struggled, but his body wouldn't respond. It was as if he had no control, as if his very existence had been swallowed by the house. He tried to scream, to fight back, but there was no sound. His mouth moved, his lungs begged for air, but all that filled his senses was the pressing, unbearable stillness. And then something stirred. At first it was just a whisper, a soft rustling sound like dry leaves skittering across the floor. But it grew louder, closer, until it became a heavy, rhythmic thud like footsteps. Ben's heart began to pound in his chest. The feeling of being watched, of something, or someone, lurking just out of sight, clawed at him. His body jerked, finally responding to the rising panic. He gasped for breath, his body trembling as he pushed himself up from the cold ground. The instant his hand touched the floor, it felt wrong. The texture wasn't smooth stone or dirt. It was something softer, something warm and yielding. Flesh. He pulled his hand back with a cry, his pulse racing. He wasn't alone. Something, or someone, was here with him. The footsteps continued, slow, steady, echoing through the darkness like a warning. Ben's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but all he could hear were those damned footsteps, getting closer and closer. Help me. The whisper came again. It was faint, weak, like a breath on the wind. But it wasn't just in his mind this time. It was real. He turned his head, his eyes scanning the blackness, desperate to find the source. The air felt thick, heavy with dread, but still there was nothing to see. Just the absence of light, the weight of silence. The whisper came again, louder now, more insistent. Help me, please. He wasn't sure what it was, but the voice sounded familiar. Almost like someone he knew. Someone from before. The thought made his chest tighten. Could it be his mother? His sister? Was this the place where they had gone, where they had disappeared? Suddenly, a flash of light. A flicker. Ben froze. A shape. A figure standing at the edge of the dark. It was just a silhouette at first, indistinct like a shadow in the corner of his vision. But then it came closer. Ben's breath caught in his throat. The figure was a woman. Her form was distorted, her movements jerky, as though she were not fully in the world, not fully alive. She was dragging herself toward him, just like the woman he had seen before. Her body was bent in an unnatural angle, her legs twisted beneath her as she crawled toward him with grotesque, jerking movements. Ben's stomach churned. This was the same woman. But how? Was she real? Was this happening? Or was he still trapped in some kind of twisted nightmare? Her face, when it came into view, was almost unrecognizable. It was a blur of pale, sagging flesh, eyes wide and unblinking. But there was something in them, a glimmer of recognition. She was staring at him, directly at him. And then she spoke. "You don't belong here," she whispered, her voice raw and broken, like something long buried, dragging itself back to the surface. Ben stumbled backward, his feet tangled in the floor beneath him. His mind was racing, spinning with questions. What was she saying? What did it mean? Did he belong here? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The house was calling to him. The house had been waiting for him. And now it had him. The woman's fingers twitched, her hand reaching toward him with a desperate urgency. Her nails were long and cracked, blackened at the tips, and as they scraped against the floor, they made a sound that was sharp and sickening, like nails on a chalkboard. Ben couldn't tear his eyes away. He was frozen, paralyzed by the sight of her, by the way her eyes burned into him. He could feel her presence like a weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. She was so close now, just a few feet away, crawling slowly, dragging herself forward with an almost agonizing slowness. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, she stopped. The room grew colder. The air grew heavier. The silence became suffocating, unbearable. Ben's heart was pounding so loudly in his ears, he could barely hear the whispers anymore. But then he felt it. The floor beneath him groaned. The house was shifting. The walls were closing in. Ben scrambled to his feet, but his legs were weak. His mind was a blur of panic, unable to focus on anything other than the overwhelming sense of dread that wrapped around him like a vice. He was running now, though he had no idea where to go. The house was changing, the air thick with an unnatural presence. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. The woman's figure had disappeared into the shadows again, but she was still there. He could feel her. He could feel her eyes on him, watching him, waiting for him to understand. The walls shook violently. Ben's stomach lurched. There was something beneath the house. Something ancient. Something alive. He heard a sound. A scraping, dragging sound. It was coming from deep within the bowels of the house, from beneath the floorboards, from the very earth itself. And then the ground cracked. Ben felt the tremor beneath his feet, followed by a deep, resounding crack that echoed through the house. The floor split open and something large, something enormous, began to rise from the depths below. It was as though the house was birthing something terrible. Ben stumbled backward, his heart racing. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to get out. The house wasn't just alive, it was waking up. And it was hungry. Ben's body was shaking, his feet unsteady on the cracking floor. The rumbling had stopped for a moment, but the air was thick with the anticipation of something terrible. A dark force pulsed beneath the house, its presence suffocating. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, trembling with something ancient and powerful. Every fiber of Ben's being screamed at him to run, but where could he go? The house was closing in around him, its very structure bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. The floor beneath him groaned again, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down his spine. He backed away, his eyes darting around, desperate for an escape. But the door he had entered through was gone. Nothing but solid, impenetrable wood now stood in its place. The hallway, the staircase, all the exits he had once seen, now seemed to be swallowed by the house itself, hidden behind walls that had shifted while he wasn't looking. The scraping sound resumed, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the floor, it was coming from the walls. The sound of something crawling, dragging itself forward, inch by painful inch. Ben felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead, his heart hammering against his chest. The woman was gone, but she wasn't the only thing here. There was something worse beneath this house. Something that wanted him. Wanted them all. Ben turned back toward the center of the room, his eyes scanning the shifting shadows. There were symbols carved into the walls now, faint at first, but growing stronger, brighter. They pulsed with an eerie light, like veins under the skin of the house itself, stretching and curling in unnatural shapes. Some were words, but none of them made sense to him. They were like nothing he had ever seen, foreign, ancient, cursed. The whispers returned, but they weren't just in his head anymore. They were all around him, echoing through the walls, vibrating in his bones. They were calling to him. Ben could feel them tugging at the edges of his consciousness, like invisible hands reaching out to drag him deeper into the darkness. And then it hit him. The house wasn't just alive, it was feeding. It was feeding on them all, drawing them in like prey. And Ben had walked right into its trap. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. It was coming from the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Ben took a step toward it, then froze. In the darkness, something moved. A figure. A shape that seemed to flicker in and out of sight, like a shadow trying to take form. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its limbs were too long, too thin. The figure was crawling on all fours, its back arched in a way that didn't seem possible for a human body. Ben's stomach lurched as the thing moved closer, its features becoming clearer in the dim light. Its face was stretched, its skin taut over the bones like a mask pulled too tight. Eyes that were wide and black stared at him, unblinking, the pupils swallowed by the darkness. The scraping sound was coming from the thing's nails as it dragged its hands across the floor. Its fingers were long, jagged, and they left deep gouges in the wood as it moved closer, inch by inch. Ben's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. He couldn't tear his eyes away. It was as though the thing was pulling him in, holding him captive with its gaze. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, their meaning slipping just out of reach. Asterisk, you are mine. Asterisk, the voice was low and guttural, filled with an unnatural hunger. Asterisk, you are the next one. Asterisk. Ben's blood ran cold. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The thing was speaking to him in a voice that sounded ancient, like it had been waiting for him. Waiting for all of them. Suddenly the house seemed to shift again. The walls creaked, groaned, and then a deep, resonating crack split the floor wide open. Ben stumbled backward, his hands outstretched as if trying to hold himself up, but the floor beneath him gave way. With a sickening lurch, he fell. The air rushed past him in a blur, and then, with a heavy thud, he hit the ground. It wasn't stone. It wasn't wood. It was soft, damp earth, and as Ben's body collided with the floor, he felt something sticky and wet seep into his clothes. The air was thick with the smell of rot, of decay. Ben's head spun, and he forced himself to sit up, his eyes struggling to adjust to the dim, oppressive darkness surrounding him. He had fallen through the floor, through the house itself, and now he found himself in some kind of underground space. The walls were dirt and stone, crumbling and unstable, as if this place had been hidden away for centuries. But the most disturbing thing was the silence. It was an unnatural silence, thick and suffocating, broken only by the occasional drip of water from somewhere deeper in the earth. Ben forced himself to his feet, his body aching from the fall. His hands were slick with the wet earth as he pushed himself up. The whispers had stopped. The thing in the room above had gone silent, but he could feel it. It was still there, watching him, waiting for the moment when it could reach out and pull him back into its grasp. There was no way out. He turned in a slow circle, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The space was narrow, barely large enough to stand in. The walls were damp with moisture, and the air felt heavier down here, thick with something foul. And then, his gaze fell on something that made his heart skip a beat. At the far end of the room, near the wall, was a small door. It was old, ancient even, and looked like it had been sealed shut for a long time. The wood was rotting, and the metal hinges were rusted and broken. But the worst part was the symbol carved into the door itself. It was the same symbol he had seen on the walls above. The same strange, twisting mark that seemed to pulse with an unholy light. Ben could feel it pulling him toward it, a magnetic force that made his stomach churn with dread. He didn't want to go near it. He didn't want to open it, but something in him, some primal instinct, drove him toward that door. He had to know what was behind it. He had to know if it was the way out or if it was something worse. The moment his hand touched the door, the ground beneath him trembled again. The walls groaned, and Ben could feel something deep within the earth, something old and hungry, stirring. The house was waking up, and Ben had just opened the door. The door creaked in protest as Ben's hand pressed against it, the hinges rusted and reluctant to move. The room around him seemed to hold its breath. The very air seemed to thicken, like something was watching, waiting for him to make the next move. A strange pressure built in his chest, as if the house itself was drawing in a breath, preparing for something terrible. His heart pounded in his ears, his hand trembling on the worn wood. He had to open it. He didn't know why, but there was an unexplainable pull, an urgency that surged through him. It wasn't just curiosity. No, this was something more, something deeper. It was as if the house itself was calling him. With one final push, the door gave way. The hinges screamed in protest, the sound echoing through the underground chamber like a death rattle. Ben winced, his fingers sliding off the handle as the door swung open, revealing what lay beyond. The darkness beyond the door was suffocating, almost tangible. It was so thick that Ben felt like he was pushing through something like a curtain made of shadows. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes adjusted, and then, as though waking from a nightmare, he saw it. The room was vast, stretching out before him like a cavern. The walls were made of stone, smooth and polished, but the surface was slick with moisture, covered in layers of dirt and mold. The floor beneath him was uneven, cracked in places, as though it had been torn apart by some immense force. And in the center of the room, something stood. There was a figure, no shapes. Hundreds of them, shifting, writhing in the darkness. Ben couldn't quite make out what they were at first. His mind refused to process it, but the sight was enough to make his blood run cold. They were like shadows, only more solid, more real. At first they moved as one, but as his eyes adjusted further, he realized they weren't just shadows. No, they were bodies, limbs, torsos, faces, all contorted in impossible positions, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. It was like a grotesque human puzzle, each part of each body mismatched, broken, fused together into something unrecognizable. The whispers started again. They were louder now, more distinct. They filled his ears, reverberated in his skull. He couldn't understand them, not at first. But then one word broke through the din. Help. Ben's knees nearly buckled. The voice was faint, weak, but unmistakable. It was the same voice he had heard before, that broken, desperate whisper. It was coming from one of the shapes, one of the bodies that twisted on the ground, its face half-formed, its eyes hollow but alive with terror. The shape jerked forward, its head lolling at an odd angle, and for a brief moment, Ben could have sworn he saw something familiar in its face. No, it couldn't be. His mind was playing tricks on him. Help me, the voice came again, and this time it was clearer. Please, before it takes us all. Ben stepped back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The shapes in the room began to shift in a more erratic pattern, their movements growing faster, more frantic. They weren't just bodies, they were people, or they had been. Their faces, their hands, all twisted and mangled, their features barely resembling anything human. And then one of the shapes moved toward him. Ben froze. His heart stopped. He couldn't move. It was as if something was holding him in place, a force stronger than his own will. The shape moved with terrifying speed, crawling toward him on all fours, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, its mouth open in a silent scream. Ben's eyes widened in horror as the thing reached out for him, its fingers stretching toward him like claws, its face contorting into a grotesque mask of terror. No. Ben screamed, stumbling back. His legs didn't obey him. They were stiff, heavy like lead. His breath came in shallow gasps. He couldn't get away. He couldn't move fast enough. The shape grabbed his ankle. Ben's scream cut off as he was yanked forward. His hands scraped across the stone floor, but there was nothing to grip onto, nothing to stop the pull. The shape was impossibly strong, its grip like iron, and it dragged him toward the center of the room, where the other bodies were writhing. Help us. The voice was louder now, echoing in his skull, reverberating through his entire body. It was no longer one voice, but hundreds, no thousands, each voice blending into the next. It was the sound of desperation, of pure terror. And then the darkness seemed to part. There, in the center of the room, was something else. Something that had been waiting, lurking beneath the mass of twisted bodies. A figure, taller than any of the shapes, standing in the center like a monument to suffering. It was a man? No, not a man. Something else entirely. His face was pale, stretched like skin pulled too tight over bones. His eyes were black pits, devoid of light, but they glimmered with an unnatural gleam, like something ancient and malevolent was trapped within them. He was tall, impossibly tall, standing above the writhing bodies with an air of utter dominance. Ben's heart stopped. The figure's eyes locked onto his. "You're too late," the figure whispered, its voice like gravel, rough and choking. It's already begun. Ben opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The air had thickened around him, pressing down on his chest. The figure stepped forward, its feet barely touching the floor as it moved with an eerie fluidity. It was as though the man was gliding, floating just above the ground. As he approached, Ben felt an overwhelming sense of cold, like an icy wind had blown through his very soul. The thing reached out, its hand like a skeletal claw, and Ben's body froze. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He could only watch, helpless, as the figure's fingers brushed against his cheek. "You belong to the house now," the figure murmured, its lips curling into a twisted smile. Asterisk, "You've all been chosen." Asterisk. Suddenly, the floor beneath Ben cracked, and everything, his thoughts, his senses, his very being, plunged into a void. The house was pulling him in. It was hungry, and it was not going to let him go. Ben awoke with a violent gasp, his body jerking upright, heart racing in a way that felt unnatural. His hands shot out in front of him, but he felt nothing but cold air. No walls, no floor beneath him, just the empty, oppressive void. For a moment, he thought he was still trapped in the darkness beneath the house, but his senses slowly began to adjust, and the weight in his chest lifted slightly. He wasn't in the cavern anymore. The room around him was dim, lit only by the pale flicker of a dying fire in a far corner. His legs were tangled in old, dusty blankets, his body aching as if he had been dragged across 1,000 miles of stone. The stale air felt heavy in his lungs, and the oppressive silence threatened to choke him. He sat in a corner of a small room, one that seemed to have been abandoned for ages. The walls were covered in cobwebs, and the floor was littered with forgotten furniture. Old chairs, a sagging table, and what looked like the remnants of long-dead plants. The fire crackled, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. Ben slowly stood, his legs unsteady, his mind reeling from the events that had transpired, or had they been a dream? It was hard to tell. Was the horror in the caverns real? Or had he simply imagined it, a trick of his mind in the claustrophobic depths of that cursed house? He reached for his head, feeling the cold sweat on his forehead and the sharp pulse of his headache. As his hand brushed against the wall, he froze. The surface was slick with something wet. He pulled his fingers back and stared at them. What? The floor beneath him shifted, groaning with the familiar deep rumble, and for a fleeting moment, Ben wondered if the house was about to swallow him whole. His heart skipped a beat. Was it waking up again? He turned quickly, his breath shallow, trying to locate the source of the sound. His eyes darted from the door to the walls, to the corners of the room, but nothing moved. Not at first. But then, just as the weight in his chest began to lift, a figure appeared in the doorway. A shape so dark that it blended into the shadows surrounding it. Ben's breath caught in his throat as he watched the figure step forward. It was tall, taller than any human should be, and its movements were slow, deliberate. Ben's pulse spiked as it entered the room fully, revealing the silhouette of the thing he had seen earlier, the one with the hollow eyes, the cracked, twisted features. It was no longer crawling, no longer hiding in the dark corners of his mind. It was here in the flesh, or what passed for flesh. Asterisk, you can't escape, asterisk, it whispered, its voice like the scraping of nails across glass, grating and unbearable. Asterisk, it's too late for you. Too late for all of you. Asterisk. Ben's eyes widened as he backed away, his hands up in front of him as if to ward off the thing. He was trapped. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a hallucination. Asterisk, no. Please, asterisk, Ben stammered, his voice barely a whisper. But the thing didn't stop. It took another step, and then another, its long limbs moving with unnatural grace. The smell of rot and decay filled the air as it neared him. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the far side of the room, and Ben turned, startled. The fire in the corner had erupted, a burst of flame shooting out of the hearth, filling the room with a blinding light. Ben shielded his eyes, blinking against the heat and sudden brightness. The thing paused, its dark eyes narrowing in the direction of the fire. Then, with an almost imperceptible movement, it stepped back, melting into the shadows. Ben's heart was hammering in his chest, his hands slick with sweat, but he didn't dare move. Not yet. A voice, soft and breathless, spoke to him from the other side of the room. Asterisk, you have to listen. You have to listen carefully. Asterisk. Ben turned slowly, his pulse racing. There, in the corner of the room, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, her face pale and drawn, her clothes ragged and torn. Her hair was tangled, her eyes wide with a terror that Ben recognized all too well. It was the woman from the hallway, the one who had warned him about the house. Her eyes met his, and in them, Ben saw a reflection of the same fear that was gnawing at his insides. Asterisk. I can't escape, asterisk, she whispered, her voice trembling. Ben's throat tightened, his mind spinning. What do you mean? What's going on here? The woman's eyes flickered toward the doorway where the dark shape had stood moments before, her face paling further. Asterisk, it's him. He's the one who keeps us here. He's the one who makes us stay. Asterisk. Ben took a cautious step forward, ignoring the cold creeping up his spine. Asterisk, who? Asterisk. Asterisk, the one in the basement. Asterisk. The word sent a chill through him. He had heard those words before, the ones that had echoed in his head when the house had swallowed him into its depths. The figure in the shadows, the one that had nearly taken him. Asterisk, the one in the basement? Asterisk. The woman nodded, her voice low, barely audible. Asterisk, it's not a house. It's a prison. It takes what it wants, and it never lets go. Asterisk. Ben's mind raced. He had to know more. He had to understand what had happened, what was happening now. What does it want with us? What does it want from me? The woman took a step back, her face twisted in horror as she stared at him. She seemed to shrink in on herself, her hands trembling. Asterisk, you should have never come here. You don't understand. It feeds on the living. It uses us. It makes us, asterisk. Her voice trailed off and Ben felt a surge of panic. She was fading, slipping away. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows growing deeper and the temperature dropping sharply. The light from the fire flickered, struggling to stay alive as a low, guttural sound began to rumble from deep within the house. Ben looked toward the door. The thing was coming back. He could feel it. The air itself seemed to distort with the pressure, and the walls of the room pulsed with the rhythm of something breathing, something alive. Ben had only one choice left: to face the thing or to run and risk the house swallowing him whole. But before he could make the decision, the woman's voice whispered one final warning, her words barely discernible against the deafening sound of the house. Asterisk, he knows you now. He knows who you are. And he's coming for you. Asterisk. The room went silent, save for the deafening thud of his own heartbeat. And then the door slammed shut. Happened what was happening now. What does it want with us? What does it want from me? The woman took a step back, her face twisted in horror as she stared at him. She seemed to shrink in on herself, her hands trembling. Asterisk, you should have never come here. You don't understand. It feeds on the living. It uses us. It makes us, asterisk. Her voice trailed off and Ben felt a surge of panic. She was fading, slipping away. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows growing deeper and the temperature dropping sharply. The light from the fire flickered, struggling to stay alive as a low, guttural sound began to rumble from deep within the house. Ben looked toward the door. The thing was coming back. He could feel it. The air itself seemed to distort with the pressure, and the walls of the room pulsed with the rhythm of something breathing, something alive. Ben had only one choice left: to face the thing or to run and risk the house swallowing him whole. But before he could make the decision, the woman's voice whispered one final warning, her words barely discernible against the deafening sound of the house. Asterisk, he knows you now. He knows who you are. And he's coming for you. Asterisk. The room went silent, save for the deafening thud of his own heartbeat. And then the door slammed shut. Ben's heart was in his throat, and every instinct screamed at him to run, to get away from whatever was coming. But the room around him felt like it was closing in, as if the very walls were pressing down on him. The door had slammed shut, the thick wooden barrier now sealed tight. There was no way out. He turned back to the woman in the corner, but she was gone. Her form, so vivid moments before, had vanished into the dark corners of the room. His eyes darted around, searching, but there was no trace of her. The shadows twisted and flickered, moving in unnatural ways, their shapes shifting with a malevolent intelligence. The air was thick with a sense of wrongness. The fire in the corner, which had been crackling and bright, was now nothing more than a faint glow, its embers dying, its heat fading into the oppressive cold of the room. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faintest creak of the wooden floor beneath him. Ben's breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. He reached out for the door handle, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold brass. It didn't move. The door was locked, or maybe it was something worse than a lock, something that wasn't meant to open. A low, almost imperceptible hum began to fill the room. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, and soon it was impossible to ignore. The sound was like a deep, vibrating growl reverberating through the walls, through the floor, through his bones. It was the house, Ben realized. It was alive. The temperature in the room plummeted, his breath visible in the icy air. His hands ached from the cold, and his teeth began to chatter as the darkness seemed to deepen. The shadows no longer simply lingered in the corners. They moved toward him, slithering across the floor like liquid darkness, pooling at his feet. The room began to shift. The floorboards creaked and groaned beneath him, as if the entire house was alive, breathing, shifting with some malevolent intent. Ben stumbled backward, his feet tripping over the cluttered furniture in the room. His eyes widened as he saw the shadows gather in front of him, taking shape, forming into something solid, something real. A figure began to emerge from the darkness, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps. It was tall, taller than any man he had ever seen, and it moved with an unnatural grace as though it didn't need to walk, just glide above the ground. The same dark shape that had followed him through the halls, that had appeared in the basement. Ben's blood ran cold. The thing was here. It stopped in the center of the room, and for the first time Ben saw its face, or what remained of it. The skin was stretched taut, pale, and cracked like old porcelain, the eyes dark pits of nothingness, swirling with a malevolent energy that made his stomach churn. It was an empty vessel, a thing born of the house itself, a manifestation of the evil that resided within its walls. The creature reached out a hand, long fingers that seemed to stretch farther than they should, its fingertips brushing against the wall as if testing the room, as if it could feel the very heartbeat of the house. Ben's body froze, paralyzed by a sense of utter dread. The air around him seemed to thicken, and the pressure in his chest grew, tightening like a vice. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. Then it spoke. Asterisk, you have no choice. Asterisk. Its voice was deep and guttural, like the scraping of stone on stone. It was a sound that didn't come from the creature's mouth but from everywhere, from the walls, from the floor, from the very air itself. Ben's eyes darted around, his mind racing. No choice? What was it talking about? Was it referring to the house? Was this the thing that had been waiting for him all along? There is no escape, it continued, its voice growing louder. Asterisk, not for you, not for any of them. The house claims you. It always claims what it wants. Asterisk. Ben's mind was whirling, the pressure in his chest almost unbearable. The room seemed to be collapsing around him, the walls closing in, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. He could feel the temperature drop even more, the chill seeping deep into his bones. It was getting harder to think, harder to breathe. You are mine now, the thing whispered, its voice like a sickening caress. Asterisk, you will become one with this place. You will stay with us forever. Asterisk. The shadows began to stretch toward him, tendrils of darkness reaching for his skin, wrapping around his limbs, pulling him in. Ben struggled, trying to break free, but the darkness was relentless. His body felt heavy, like he was drowning in it. Every movement he made was slower, more sluggish, as though the house itself was weighing him down, trapping him in its grip. His vision blurred, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw the woman again, standing in the corner, her eyes wide with terror. But when he tried to call out to her, the words stuck in his throat. The house swallowed them just as it had swallowed her. Help me, Ben gasped, his voice barely a whisper, lost in the overwhelming silence. Asterisk, please, help me. Asterisk. But the thing didn't respond. It didn't need to. Instead, it simply watched as the shadows closed in on Ben, as the darkness began to suffocate him. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The house had silenced him, had taken away his voice, just as it had taken away his freedom. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the figure in the corner, the woman's face pale and distant, her eyes hollow as she whispered one final word. Asterisk, run. Asterisk. Ben's world had gone completely black, and for a moment he thought he was dead. There was no pain, no sensation, just an overwhelming void, a suffocating nothingness. His body felt weightless, suspended in this eternal blackness, his mind struggling to grasp onto any semblance of thought. His last image before the darkness claimed him had been the woman's face, her words ringing in his ears, asterisk, run. Asterisk, but there was no running now. Not here. Not now. Then, through the haze of nothingness, something began to seep into his awareness. A faint glimmer. A distant, flickering light that seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own, like a heartbeat. It was weak at first, barely a whisper against the oppressive dark, but it grew stronger as if it was calling to him. Ben felt a strange pull toward it. His body shifted, his limbs responding in ways they shouldn't. He tried to move, tried to push himself toward the light, but it felt as though an invisible force was holding him back. His mind fought against it, tried to break free, but there was no escape. The house was with him now. It had claimed him just as the thing had said. The light flickered again, a heartbeat. And then, as if something had snapped, he was moving. His body jerked forward, his legs carrying him faster than he ever could on his own. He felt as though he was flying, being pulled by an unseen force, his head spinning with the rush of sensation. His surroundings blurred and he couldn't tell where he was anymore. The blackness and the light mixed together, swirling, twisting into something unrecognizable. And then, just as quickly as it had started, he was back. The room was no longer cold. The suffocating darkness had lifted, and the stale air of the house was gone. Ben blinked, his eyes adjusting to the sudden change. He was no longer in the cursed room. He was back in the hallway, standing in front of the same door he had opened hours, maybe days ago. His heart pounded in his chest as his mind struggled to make sense of what had just happened. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers grazing the door. The wood was smooth beneath his touch, normal, ordinary, as if nothing had changed. But deep in the pit of his stomach, he knew something was terribly wrong. The house was still alive. It was still watching. A noise broke the silence, distant at first but growing louder. A low rumble that echoed through the halls. It sounded like something heavy moving, shifting in the depths of the house. Ben's breath caught in his throat. It was coming closer. He turned toward the sound, his legs unsteady, the room spinning as the weight of it all pressed in on him. His gaze locked onto the end of the hallway, where shadows seemed to grow deeper, pooling like ink, curling around the corners of the room. The walls began to pulse again, as though the house was breathing in time with his own frantic heartbeat. And then, from the darkness, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy, relentless. Ben's breath hitched as the figure emerged from the shadows. It was him, the thing he had faced before, the creature that had haunted his every step since he first arrived. The same hollow eyes, the same twisted features, only now it was more. It was more alive, more solid, more real than ever before. Ben's pulse quickened. He didn't know how he had gotten here or how long he had been trapped in this nightmare. But one thing was clear, he had no way out. The house had him body and soul. And the thing in front of him wasn't going to let him escape. Not again. The creature's mouth curled into a grotesque smile, revealing jagged teeth that seemed to shimmer with malice. It stepped forward, its long, twisted limbs moving with an eerie grace. Each step it took seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. "You're too late," it whispered, its voice seeping into Ben's skull like poison. Asterisk, "You were always going to be mine." Asterisk. Ben's knees felt weak, his body trembling with a mix of fear and exhaustion. The thing was getting closer, its form becoming clearer, more defined with each passing moment. He had no way of knowing how long he had been in the house, how much time had slipped away while he fought for his sanity. Was it hours? Days? It didn't matter. The house had always been in control. But then, as the creature reached out with its long, bony hand, something inside Ben snapped. The darkness, the fear, the suffocating grip of the house. He couldn't let it win. He refused to let it take him. With a cry, he stumbled backward, pushing off the wall, his body surging with newfound strength. He didn't know where the strength came from, but it didn't matter. He ran. The thing in the hallway lunged at him, its fingers grazing the back of his neck, but Ben didn't stop. He bolted down the corridor, his feet pounding against the old wood floor. His mind was a whirlwind, his thoughts scattered as he searched for an escape. But the house wasn't done with him. It would never be done. Ben reached the stairs, his hand grabbing the railing as he barreled up, the house groaning underfoot as though it was alive, enraged by his resistance. The walls shook, the floorboards creaked louder than ever, and Ben's head spun. He couldn't stop now. He couldn't let it catch him. The top of the stairs was in sight. There was a door, a way out. He pushed himself faster, but the house seemed to move faster, the footsteps of the creature echoing behind him, relentless. He could feel it closing in. And then, as he reached the door, a scream ripped through the air. It wasn't his scream. It wasn't the creature's scream either. It was a woman's voice, high-pitched, desperate, calling his name from behind the door. Asterisk, Ben, asterisk. He froze. It was her. The woman from the room, from the basement, from the shadows. She was alive, or at least she had been alive. Was she trying to warn him again? Or was she something worse? Something the house had turned into one of its endless prisoners. Ben's hand was on the doorknob, but he didn't know what to do. Behind him, the creature's footsteps were getting closer. He had to make a choice. He had no time left. The door swung open.